After I dropped my wife of 25 years at the airport terminal for her corporate retreat, my 20-year-old son grabbed my forearm with trembling fingers and whispered that we could not go home because he heard her planning a fatal accident for us tonight. 10 minutes later, I stood in the woods behind our estate and watched two strangers unlock my front door with my wife's personal security code. Before I share the rest of this nightmare, let me know which city you are listening from down in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you believe that the truth always comes to light, no matter how deeply someone tries to bury it. I am James Callahan, a 68-year-old retired commercial contractor, and my life shattered on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday afternoon. The fluorescent lights of the International Departures Terminal buzzed above us as I pulled my truck up to the curb. Valerie wore her tailored charcoal suit and a silk scarf, smiling warmly as she leaned across the center console to kiss my cheek. Her perfume smelled like vanilla and expensive leather. She patted my chest exactly where my heart monitor used to be taped just 6 months ago and told me to rest while she was in Denver. I promised her I would take it easy and watch a baseball game with our son Leo. She grabbed her rolling luggage from the back seat, blew me a final kiss, and disappeared through the automatic sliding glass doors without looking back. I put the truck in drive, ready to head back to our quiet suburban estate. That was when Leo reached across the cab and grabbed my wrist with a grip so tight his knuckles turned completely white. My son has always been a quiet observer who rarely speaks unless he has something vital to say. His eyes were wide with a raw, primal terror I had never seen in him before. He leaned in close, his voice shaking violently as he begged me not to take the highway back to our house. I asked him if he felt sick or needed a doctor. He shook his head frantically and told me the absolute terrifying truth. Late last night, while I was asleep, he had gone downstairs for a glass of water and heard Valerie speaking quietly on her secure burner phone in the study. She was speaking to a man about a timeline for our permanent removal. Leo heard his own mother confirm that the fire needed to start exactly at 9 o'clock and that both of us had to be inside the house when the roof collapsed. My brain struggled to process the sheer weight of his words. A wife does not simply order the execution of her husband and her own son. But Leo was not crying, and he was not hallucinating. He was stating a concrete, terrifying fact. I looked at the digital clock on the dashboard, glowing bright green. It was 8:45 in the evening. We had exactly 15 minutes before our scheduled executions. I did not waste a single second arguing with my son or demanding more context. When a child looks at you with the absolute certainty of impending death, you do not ask questions, you act. I slammed my foot on the accelerator and merged onto the dark stretch of the interstate, heading in the general direction of our neighborhood. The drive felt like a descent into madness. The rhythmic thumping of the tires against the pavement echoed the frantic beating of my chest. I kept my eyes locked on the road, while my mind raced through decades of marriage, searching for a clue or a warning sign I had somehow missed. Valerie had always been driven and ambitious, but the leap from a demanding spouse to a cold-blooded murderer seemed physically impossible to comprehend. Yet the sheer terror radiating from the passenger seat anchored me to the undeniable reality of the present moment. I bypassed the main entrance to our gated community entirely. If Valerie had hired professionals, they would likely have lookouts positioned near the main thoroughfares. Instead, I navigated through the older adjacent neighborhood and steered my heavy truck into an abandoned, unfinished cul-de-sac, 3 blocks away from the rear boundary of our property. The streetlights here were dead, and the massive oak trees provided a perfect natural curtain of absolute darkness. I cut the engine and plunged the cabin into silence. I turned to Leo and told him we were going to move quickly and quietly through the woods to get a clear line of sight on the back of our house. We stepped out into the damp evening air. The ground was soft and covered in thick layers of wet autumn leaves. I used my decades of experience walking construction sites to guide our path, stepping carefully over exposed roots and fallen branches to avoid making any sound. My knees ached with the effort, and the chill of the night air bit through my thin cotton jacket, but adrenaline masked the physical discomfort. Leo stayed right on my heels, breathing shallowly through his nose just as I instructed. We navigated the dense underbrush until we reached the sharp incline that overlooked our backyard. I dropped low to the ground and motioned for Leo to crouch beside a massive rotting tree stump. From this elevated vantage point, we had a perfect, unobstructed view of the entire rear facade of our sprawling stone house. The expansive windows of the living room glowed warmly against the dark forest backdrop. Everything looked peaceful and entirely normal. The patio furniture sat perfectly arranged around the stone fire pit. For a fleeting, desperate second, I wanted to believe that Leo had misunderstood a conversation about a home renovation or a landscaping project. I watched from the cold, muddy ground, expecting the men to struggle or trigger the perimeter floodlights. Instead, the taller of the two men calmly reached out and flipped open the protective cover of the digital keypad. He did not hesitate or fumble in the dark. He raised his gloved hand and rapidly punched in a 6-digit numerical sequence. A sharp electronic beep echoed through the quiet night air, followed instantly by the heavy mechanical clack of the steel deadbolt retracting into the doorframe. The small indicator light on the security panel shifted from a solid warning red to a welcoming bright green. My stomach twisted into a violent, nauseating knot. The code that man just entered was not the standard family code we used daily. It was not the temporary code I gave to our housekeeper or the maintenance workers. It was Valerie's personal master override code. It was a highly secure sequence that only she and I knew entirely, designed to bypass every single alarm sensor inside the house simultaneously. She had willingly handed the keys to our destruction directly to these strangers. The sheer magnitude of her betrayal struck me with the force of a physical blow to the chest. The men pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped inside my home as easily as if they were invited dinner guests. The door closed quietly behind them, swallowing them into the dark interior. Leo pressed his shoulder against mine, trembling violently as he witnessed the exact nightmare he had warned me about playing out in real time. We were watching the mechanics of our own orchestrated murders unfold from 30 yards away. If we had driven straight home from the airport and sat down on the living room sofa to watch a baseball game as I had planned, we would currently be trapped inside with two professional killers. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead, despite the freezing temperature of the autumn woods. The men were not inside to steal anything. They were inside to execute a contract and clean up the evidence. I gripped Leo by the shoulder, squeezing tightly to let him know I was firmly in control, even though my entire reality was currently crumbling into dust. We remained perfectly still, hidden within the thick, wet foliage, waiting to see exactly how these hired ghosts planned to carry out my wife's final, devastating order. The silence stretched out, feeling like hours instead of seconds, while I calculated our incredibly slim chances of survival. I focused my eyes intensely on the large bay windows of the living room, desperately trying to track their movements through the sheer curtains. I could see the faint beams of their small tactical flashlights sweeping across the imported rugs and the expensive leather furniture I had purchased for Valerie just last year. Every passing second felt heavy and suffocating. The reality of the situation anchored itself deep in my bones. My own wife had meticulously weaponized the very sanctuary I built for her, transforming our beautiful, quiet home into a custom-designed slaughterhouse for me and our only child. Through the expansive glass panels of the living room, I watched the two men reappear from the hallway, carrying heavy dark canvas bags that they had hauled in from the black van. They dropped the thick bags onto the center of the hardwood floor with a heavy, muffled thud. The shorter man unzipped the main compartment and pulled out two large red industrial gas canisters. The bold yellow warning labels on the sides of the metal containers were clearly visible even from my concealed vantage point in the dark woods. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs as the horrific reality of their methodology became undeniably clear. They were not planning to shoot us and stage a robbery. A violent home invasion always leaves messy, unpredictable evidence and opens the door for a prolonged police investigation. Valerie was far too calculated and intelligent for that kind of risk. She wanted a tragic, devastating accident. She wanted a narrative that would instantly generate overwhelming public sympathy and guarantee a swift, massive insurance payout without any lingering questions from aggressive detectives. The men began unscrewing the heavy plastic caps of the canisters. I watched in absolute frozen horror as they systematically moved through the main floor of my house. They began pouring thick, clear liquid accelerant across the expensive Persian rugs, over the velvet cushions of the custom sofas, and along the baseboards of the wooden staircase that led directly up to the master bedroom where I usually slept. The man with the flashlight guided the pour, ensuring the deadly chemical covered the structural support beams and blocked all primary escape routes. My mind raced frantically, processing the horrifying sequence of events that was supposed to happen to us tonight. Valerie expected the police to find our charred, unrecognizable bodies in the morning. She expected to receive a somber phone call at her luxury hotel in Denver, where she would flawlessly play the role of the hysterical, grieving widow. She had orchestrated an airtight alibi, standing hundreds of miles away, surrounded by highly respectable corporate colleagues, while hired ghosts burned her family alive for a massive financial reward. The sheer cruelty of the plot was staggering. It required a level of deep psychological detachment and pure evil that I had completely failed to recognize in the woman I had slept next to for over 2 decades. I watched the men finish their grim task and step back out onto the front porch. The taller man pulled a small silver flare lighter from his tactical vest. He struck the flint, and a bright orange flame illuminated his harsh, emotionless features. He callously tossed the burning lighter through the open front doorway directly onto the soaked hardwood floor. The ignition was instantaneous and explosively violent. A massive wall of bright roaring fire erupted inside the foyer, instantly crawling up the walls and devouring the staircase. The blast of heat radiated out into the cold night air, warming my face even from 30 yards away in the thick woods. The men did not stick around to watch the destruction. They swiftly pulled the heavy oak door shut, containing the initial blast, pulled their dark masks back down over their faces, and jogged back to the idling black van. They slid inside, and the heavy vehicle accelerated down the long, winding driveway, disappearing into the dark suburban streets. They left behind a raging inferno that was currently consuming my entire world. I knelt in the wet dirt, watching the flames rise higher and higher, illuminating the dark forest canopy with an eerie, violent orange glow. We were completely alone in the dark, watching our lives turn to ash. The deafening roar of the fire drowned out the chaotic ringing in my ears. I squeezed my eyes shut for one brief, agonizing moment, acknowledging that the man I used to be had just died inside that burning house. The intense crackling of the rapidly expanding fire completely shattered the quiet stillness of the autumn night. Thick plumes of dark, toxic smoke began pouring from the roof vents and the shattered upper floor windows, obscuring the bright silver light of the moon. As I knelt there in the freezing, damp mud clutching my terrified son, the blinding orange light of the flames seemed to illuminate a series of dark, hidden corners in my memory. The puzzle pieces of Valerie's elaborate deception began snapping together with sickening, brutal clarity. The drip-fed realization hit me directly in the chest, harder than any physical blow I had ever received. Just 6 months ago, I had suffered a mild but terrifying heart attack while working on a massive commercial roofing project downtown. It was a sharp, sudden wake-up call that forced me into a hospital bed for a week and required a long, frustrating period of cardiovascular rehabilitation. I remembered the exact look on Valerie's face when the exhausted emergency room doctor told her that my condition was stable and that I would fully recover with proper rest and a strict new diet. At the time, I had foolishly interpreted the rigid tightness in her jaw and the cold, distant look in her eyes as sheer, overwhelming relief mixed with the trauma of almost losing her husband. Now, staring at the burning skeleton of our home, I realized that what I had actually seen on her face that night in the sterile hospital room was profound, bitter disappointment. She had been secretly hoping that nature would effortlessly do the horrific job for her. when my stubborn heart refused to give out, and I successfully returned home to begin my recovery. She immediately pivoted her strategy with aggressive, chilling efficiency. The very next week, she had relentlessly insisted that we completely update all of our joint financial portfolios and complex estate plans. She disguised her dark, morbid intentions under a thick, sweet layer of false spousal concern. She sat softly on the edge of my bed, holding my hand, and whispering that my sudden medical emergency had terrified her. She claimed she needed the absolute peace of mind that came with knowing she and Leo would be totally financially secure if the absolute worst were to happen to me in the future. I was heavily medicated, exhausted from the physical therapy, and deeply vulnerable. I blindly trusted the woman I had built an entire life alongside. I signed every single legal document she placed in front of me without bringing in my own independent counsel to review the incredibly dense fine print. I unknowingly signed away the protective barriers surrounding my hard-earned wealth. She systematically structured the new trust documents to ensure that in the event of my tragic accidental death, the entirety of my commercial contracting empire and our liquid assets would instantly bypass the standard lengthy probate process and flow directly into an offshore holding account she entirely controlled. I had essentially dug my own financial grave and handed her the shovel. The absolute totality of her betrayal crystallized in my mind like freezing ice over a deep, dark lake. She had not simply fallen out of love with me or found comfort in the arms of another man. An affair would have been painful but ordinary. A bitter, contested divorce would have been financially exhausting but manageable. Valerie did not want to split the assets or endure the public social embarrassment of a failed high-profile marriage. She looked at me, the father of her only child, and decided that I was nothing more than an expiring expiration date on a massive payday. She looked at our quiet, intelligent son and deemed him acceptable collateral damage to secure her absolute financial freedom. The heat from the burning house was now intense enough to singe the loose hairs on my arms. The heavy slate roof groaned loudly under the intense extreme thermal pressure before partially collapsing inward, sending a massive, spectacular shower of bright orange embers spiraling up into the dark night sky. The destruction was absolute and irreversible. My expensive clothes, my vintage watch collection, the family photographs, the financial records, and the physical proof of my entire existence were currently being reduced to fine gray powder. But as I watched the violent flames devour the living room, where we were supposed to die, a profound and terrifying shift occurred deep within my own psychology. The initial blinding panic and the suffocating heartbreak completely evaporated, burned away by the immense heat of the inferno. In their place, a cold, sharp, and incredibly deadly sense of absolute focus settled into my bones. Valerie believed she was a brilliant, undisputed puppet master who had just successfully executed the perfect, flawless crime. She believed I was a weak, trusting old fool who would simply burn quietly in the dark. She was spectacularly, tragically wrong. I did not scream her name into the night, and I did not shed a single useless tear. I slowly stood up from the wet mud, pulling my son up beside me. We had survived the initial explosive strike. Now the real silent war was about to begin. I placed my hand firmly on Leo's trembling shoulder and turned away. I grabbed Leo tightly by the collar of his jacket and yanked him backward into the freezing shadows. We could not stay to watch the final structural collapse of our home. The ambient heat from the inferno was becoming physically unbearable, and thick black smoke was rapidly descending into the tree line, choking the cold autumn air. Every violent crack of the burning timber sounded like a cannon firing across the quiet suburban valley. We scrambled blindly through the wet, decomposing leaves and the slick mud. My heavy work boots lost traction on the steep incline, but I forced my aching legs to keep pushing upward. I refused to let my son succumb to the paralyzing shock of the trauma unfolding just 30 yards away. We had to completely disappear before the first engine companies arrived and the police began establishing a perimeter search. We navigated the treacherous woods until we finally breached the tree line and stumbled onto the cracked asphalt of the abandoned cul-de-sac where I had hidden the truck. My chest heaved violently as I leaned against the cold, damp steel of the driver's side door, trying to catch my breath. Acting entirely on decades of modern habit, I plunged my hand into my coat pocket. I desperately wanted to pull out my cell phone to dial a trusted friend. My fingers grasped nothing but empty fabric. A sickening wave of absolute dread washed over me. I remembered exactly where I had left the device. My phone was resting on the granite kitchen island. I turned to Leo and watched him frantically pat down the pockets of his jeans before his shoulders slumped in absolute defeat. He had left his phone and his laptop resting on his bed when we rushed out to the airport. Every single piece of our personal technology was currently melting into toxic black puddles inside that blazing house. We were instantaneously and completely severed from the modern world. We had no digital maps to guide us, no contact numbers to call for backup, and absolutely no way to access our digital banking applications. Valerie had calculated every single variable. If by some miraculous intervention we survived the fiery assassination attempt, we would be thrust into the cold night as destitute ghosts. I unlocked the truck manually, using the physical key, and we quickly climbed inside the freezing dark cabin. I twisted the ignition, and the powerful engine roared to life. I deliberately kept the headlights entirely extinguished as I navigated the heavy vehicle out of the unfinished subdivision. Through the cracked passenger window, we could hear the faint but rapidly approaching wail of emergency sirens cutting through the night sky. The first responders were rushing toward our address, but they were coming to extinguish a crime scene, not to rescue a family. If I foolishly drove toward those flashing red lights, I would be walking straight back into my wife's carefully constructed narrative. She would simply cry hysterically, claim she had no idea why we were outside the house, and then calmly hire another team to finish the job. We had to remain legally dead to survive. I gripped the steering wheel and turned sharply in the opposite direction. I aggressively steered the truck away from the brightly lit interstate and merged onto the narrow, winding back roads that snaked blindly through the dark rural countryside. The subsequent drive was an exercise in suffocating, relentless paranoia. Every single pair of headlights that appeared in my rearview mirror felt like an approaching executioner. I squeezed the leather steering wheel so tightly that the muscles in my forearms began to cramp aggressively. I pushed the heavy truck as fast as I dared without risking a devastating traffic stop. If a local highway patrol officer pulled us over for a minor speeding infraction, he would run our licenses through the database. That simple administrative action would instantly alert Valerie that her hired hitmen had failed their mission. We drove in profound, heavy silence for 3 grueling, agonizing hours. The familiar, affluent, manicured suburbs of our home state slowly dissolved into the dense, unforgiving rolling hills and the desolate, empty highways of Pennsylvania. Crossing the state line offered absolutely no comfort to my racing mind. It merely cemented the terrifying reality of our new forced existence. We were literal fugitives, actively running from a highly funded murder plot, engineered by the woman who had shared my bed for 25 years. The fuel gauge on the dashboard was dropping dangerously low, and my vision was blurring from the sheer adrenaline crash. We desperately needed an untraceable place to hide before the morning sun crested the horizon and exposed our survival to the world. Shortly before 3 a.m, the heavy dark silhouette of a massive cell tower guided me toward a small, crumbling off-ramp. At the end of the gravel road stood a decaying, single-story motel that looked like it had not seen a paying customer in a decade. A flickering neon sign buzzed angrily in the cold mist, missing half of its glowing red letters. I parked the truck behind a rusted dumpster to keep it entirely out of sight from the main highway. We stepped out of the cabin, and the frigid Pennsylvania wind cut right through my thin cotton jacket. I told Leo to keep his head down and wait by the rear tire while I walked into the dimly lit reception office. A bored, exhausted clerk sat behind a thick sheet of scratched plexiglass watching a grainy television screen. He did not look up when the bell on the door chimed. I pulled my leather wallet from my back pocket and removed a crisp $50 bill, sliding it under the metal transaction slot. I asked for a room with 2 beds for the night, keeping my voice low and rough to sound like just another tired truck driver passing through. The clerk did not ask for a driver license or a credit card. He simply snatched the cash and tossed a heavy brass key attached to a faded plastic tag onto the counter. That single transaction was a terrifying, stark reminder of our new desperate reality. We were no longer wealthy citizens with platinum banking accounts and prime real estate. We were nameless shadows forced to survive in the absolute margins of society. I walked back to the truck and motioned for Leo to follow me down the long, cracked concrete walkway. We found room number 12 at the very end of the building, facing a dense thicket of dead pine trees. I turned the cold brass key in the rusted lock and pushed the heavy wooden door open. The interior smelled fiercely of stale cigarette smoke, cheap chemical disinfectant, and damp, rotting carpet. 2 narrow, lumpy beds took up almost the entire cramped space. A single solitary lamp cast a sickly yellow glow over the peeling floral wallpaper. I locked the deadbolt behind us and secured the heavy metal chain latch. Leo immediately collapsed onto the edge of the nearest bed, dropping his face into his trembling hands. The sheer exhaustion of the night was finally crushing his spirit. I stood in the center of the cramped freezing room and looked at our reflections in the cracked mirror above the tiny wooden dresser. We looked absolutely horrifying. Our faces were streaked with dark brown mud and black soot from the forest floor. Our clothes were thoroughly soaked with freezing sweat and smelled heavily of the acrid, toxic smoke that had just consumed our home. We had literally nothing except the clothes we were currently wearing. I told Leo to take off his wet shoes while I emptied the contents of my pockets onto the stained bedspread. I needed to assess exactly what we had left to fight a multimillionaire who wanted us dead. The inventory was incredibly pathetic. I laid out my heavy steel watch, a silver money clip, my leather wallet, and the metallic truck keys. I opened the wallet and carefully counted the remaining paper currency. I had exactly $214 in cash. I stared at the small pile of wrinkled green bills with a sinking, suffocating feeling in my chest. $200 would barely cover gasoline and cheap food for under 3 days. I had 3 platinum credit cards tucked inside the leather folds, but they were completely useless to us now. The moment I swiped one of those cards at a gas station or a pharmacy, a digital geographic flag would instantly alert Valerie and her hired ghosts to our exact location. Using my own money would be a direct beacon signaling our survival. The financial fortress I had spent 40 hard years building brick by brick was entirely locked away from me. I was a successful commercial contractor who managed massive budgets every day, but in this rotting room I was officially destitute. The crushing realization of our absolute vulnerability threatened to pull me into a deep, dark panic. I could not let Leo see my fear. He was depending on me to navigate us out of this waking nightmare. I gathered the cash and placed it safely back into my pocket. I walked over to the small sink and splashed freezing water onto my face, forcing my racing mind to slow down and focus on immediate logic. We could not survive on cash alone, and we could not hide in this damp room forever. The immediate, terrifying problem was very clear. I needed an untraceable internet connection right at the break of dawn to see just how deeply my wife had buried me. The pale morning sunlight filtered through the thin gaps in the motel room curtains, casting long gray shadows across the stained carpet. I woke up sitting in the uncomfortable plastic chair by the door, where I had kept watch all night. Leo was still asleep on the narrow bed, his breathing heavy and exhausted. I quietly stood up and splashed some cold tap water on my face. I grabbed my keys and slipped out of the room, locking the heavy door behind me. I drove the truck 3 miles down the rural highway until I found the small brick building of the local county library. It was just opening its doors for the day. I walked inside and kept my head down, avoiding eye contact with the elderly librarian arranging books near the entrance. I found a secluded computer terminal in the far back corner of the reference section. The plastic keyboard was sticky, and the monitor hummed with a low, irritating frequency. I pulled up the internet browser and typed in the web address for my primary commercial bank. My hands hovered over the keys for a brief second before I entered my standard username and the complex alphanumeric password I had used for the last 5 years. I clicked the login button and waited for the screen to load. A bright red error message immediately popped up on the screen indicating that the password was incorrect. I assumed my thick fingers had made a simple typing mistake in my exhausted state. I carefully retyped the password, making absolutely sure every single letter and number was accurate. I clicked the button again. The same glaring red error message appeared. My heart began to beat faster against my ribs. I navigated to the password recovery page and requested a reset link be sent to my personal email address. The system prompted me to answer my secondary security questions. It asked for the name of my first pet and the city where I was born. I typed in the answers and hit submit. The screen refreshed and displayed a cold, automated message stating that my account had been entirely locked due to suspicious activity and that I needed to call the main branch during regular business hours to verify my identity. I could not call the main branch. If I used a phone to contact my bank, the call would be recorded and flagged. A cold sweat broke out across the back of my neck. I quickly opened a new tab and navigated to the online portal for my private investment firm. This was the institution that held my retirement funds and the massive liquid capital I used to finance my commercial contracting projects. I typed in my credentials and held my breath. The system rejected my password. I tried my secondary email account. It was locked. I tried the login for our joint family trust portal. It denied me access. Valerie had systematically gone through every single digital vault I possessed and changed the locks while I was sleeping in the same house. My mind raced desperately, looking for a single overlooked loophole. I remembered a small, obscure credit monitoring account I had set up years ago when my business identity was briefly compromised. I had linked it to my social security number rather than my standard email address. I typed in the web address and entered my personal identification data. The screen buffered for a long, agonizing moment before finally loading my current financial dashboard. I clicked on the Recent Activity tab, and my blood ran completely cold. The digital ledger displayed a horrifying synchronized massacre of my life's work. Over the exact course of the last 48 hours, while Valerie was packing her bags and kissing my cheek, every single joint account we shared had been systematically drained to the absolute bottom. I watched the time-stamped transaction history, read like a forensic report of my own murder. She had started with the liquid savings transferring $300,000 into an unknown routing number. 4 hours later, she liquidated the mutual funds, taking the early withdrawal penalties without a second thought. The next morning, she had moved $2 million from the commercial operating accounts, completely paralyzing my contracting business. The final transaction had occurred just hours before she boarded her flight to Denver. She had wired the remaining $8 million from our joint trust directly into a newly established offshore holding company. The final balance on every single account displayed a solid, unforgiving 0. I stared at the glowing monitor as the sheer magnitude of her meticulous planning crushed the remaining breath from my lungs. She had not just planned to burn me alive in our home. She had meticulously stripped the flesh from the bones of my financial empire before ever striking the match. I sat in the quiet library, completely paralyzed by the absolute devastation staring back at me from the screen. I was a man who had built massive steel and concrete structures across the city. I had employed hundreds of men and managed budgets that rivaled small towns. Now I was sitting in a plastic chair in rural Pennsylvania with exactly $200 in my pocket and a murdered identity. She had stolen 4 decades of my blood, sweat, and sacrifice with a few keystrokes. The anger that slowly began to bubble up from the depths of my stomach was unlike anything I had ever felt before. It was not a hot, explosive rage. It was a cold, dark, and incredibly dense fury. I logged out of the credit portal and wiped the browser history completely clean. I could not fight a sophisticated financial war with my bare hands. I needed someone who operated in the shadows, someone who knew how to track stolen money through the darkest corners of the global banking system. I needed someone who owed me their life. I pushed my chair back from the desk and walked out of the library into the bright morning sun, ready to make the phone call that would begin my resurrection. I walked out of the county library with a cold, burning focus and drove the truck straight to a dilapidated gas station on the outskirts of the rural town. I walked down the narrow, dusty aisles and grabbed a cheap plastic prepaid cellular phone off a cardboard display rack. I handed the cashier a $50 bill and purchased the device along with a block of prepaid minutes. I was trading my last remaining lifeline of physical cash for a digital weapon. I sat inside the freezing cab of the truck and tore the plastic packaging open with my teeth. I assembled the cheap phone and waited for the small screen to illuminate with a weak cellular signal. I did not need to search the internet for the phone number I was about to call. It was a specific 10-digit sequence I had committed to memory over 15 years ago. The number belonged to Mike Brody. Brody was not your standard private investigator who spent his days taking photographs of cheating spouses from the front seat of a sedan. He was a highly trained corporate security consultant who operated strictly in the dangerous gray margins of the law. During the aggressive early days of building my commercial contracting empire, my ruthless competitors often resorted to corporate espionage to undercut my bids. Brody was the fiercely paranoid operative I kept on a heavy retainer to sweep my corporate boardrooms for hidden listening devices and to completely dismantle any external sabotage attempts. He possessed a profound understanding of the darkest corners of the financial and legal systems. We had forged a deep mutual respect in those high-stakes environments. Years ago, when a corrupt local politician tried to destroy his private agency with a baseless, frivolous lawsuit, I had quietly paid his exorbitant legal defense fees out of my own pocket to keep him afloat. He owed me his livelihood, and he was one of the few men on earth who valued absolute loyalty over personal convenience. I dialed the number and pressed the small green call button. The line rang 4 distinct times before a rough, gravelly voice answered the connection without offering a name or a greeting. I pressed the plastic speaker tightly against my ear and spoke my name softly into the microphone. A heavy, dead silence stretched across the open line. I knew exactly what Brody was thinking. The national morning news syndicates were undoubtedly already broadcasting the horrific breaking story about the tragic, catastrophic fire at the Callahan estate. The media would be portraying my wife as a weeping, devastated widow, and I was supposed to be a pile of unrecognizable ash. Brody did not panic or hang up the phone. He demanded that I verify my identity by answering a highly specific question that only the two of us would possibly know. He asked me for the precise last name of the corrupt municipal building inspector we had cornered and exposed for bribery over a decade ago. I gave him the correct answer without a single second of hesitation. I heard a long, heavy exhale of profound relief echo through the receiver. I told him I was completely cut off from my old life and could not risk explaining the terrifying details over an unsecured cellular connection. I explained that my wife had meticulously drained every single financial account I possessed and had just attempted to burn me and my son alive. I needed his immediate untraceable assistance. I instructed him to look deeply into Valerie and her covert financial movements over the past few months. I told him to completely ignore the standard banking institutions because those vaults were already empty. I needed him to dig directly into the obscure corporate registries and the high-level private insurance underwriters. I had to know the exact legal mechanism she planned to use to legally profit from our orchestrated murders. Brody told me in a low, serious tone to power the device completely off and to wait exactly 3 hours before turning it back on. He warned me that Valerie might have hired professionals to monitor the regional cellular towers for any sudden anomalies. I disconnected the call, removed the battery from the back of the phone, and drove back to the decaying motel. The subsequent 3 hours were an excruciating psychological torture. I paced the length of the cramped, stained carpet, while Leo remained quietly curled on the narrow bed. My mind relentlessly replayed the horrifying image of the arsonists pouring the toxic accelerant across our living room floor. When the plastic clock on the bedside table finally indicated that 3 hours had passed, I reinserted the battery and powered the cheap phone back on. The device vibrated almost instantly in my hand. I answered the call, and Brody spoke in a tight, urgent voice that sent a fresh, freezing wave of absolute dread straight through my veins. He had completely bypassed the standard legal protocols and hacked into a highly proprietary global insurance database. He had found the definitive smoking gun. He discovered a massive, newly established corporate life insurance policy that had been heavily expedited through the complex underwriting process. It was not a standard, modest family protection plan. It was a comprehensive $15 million payout clause that specifically covered both my life and the life of my 20-year-old son. The horrifying devil was hidden deep within the legal details. The official document had been signed and legally bound exactly 30 days ago, right when I was distracted and recovering from my heart attack. The primary beneficiary listed on the massive policy was not my wife. The $15 million was contractually designed to bypass all domestic legal scrutiny and be wired directly into an obscure offshore limited liability company registered in the Cayman Islands. Brody had aggressively followed the digital paper trail and cracked the corporate veil of that hidden company. It was a secret joint venture perfectly split between 2 managing directors. The first director was Valerie Callahan. The second director was a prominent, wealthy commercial real estate developer named Trent Lawson. The revelation hit me like a physical punch to the jaw. Trent Lawson was not a stranger. He was a ruthless, aggressive competitor in the commercial development sector who had actively tried to destroy my business several times over the last decade. My wife had not just planned to murder me for money. She had formed a deadly romantic and financial alliance with my greatest professional enemy to finance their own empire with the blood of her family. I sat alone in the freezing cab of the truck, gripping the cheap plastic phone until my knuckles ached. The horrifying truth about my wife and Trent Lawson settled into my chest like poured concrete. I looked through the cracked windshield toward the peeling paint of room number 12, where my son was currently hiding. For his entire life, Valerie had treated Leo like an inconvenient shadow. While the wives of my wealthy business partners paraded their loud, aggressively competitive sons through country club dinners and Ivy League alumni events, Valerie had always looked at our boy with a thinly veiled expression of profound disappointment. Leo was never the star quarterback or the charismatic debater she desperately wanted to show off to her elite social circle. He was a quiet, deeply introverted young man who preferred the complex, solitary world of computer architecture and advanced coding to crowded cocktail parties. I remembered the countless times she would sigh dramatically and dismiss him from the dinner table, telling her friends that he lacked the ruthless drive required to survive in the modern competitive world. She constantly berated him for spending hours locked in his bedroom, disassembling complex server motherboards, instead of networking with the children of her wealthy peers. I had always fiercely defended him, telling her that his mind simply operated on a much higher, quieter frequency than she could ever possibly understand. But standing there in the cold Pennsylvania morning, I realized that her profound, arrogant blindness was about to become our absolute salvation. She had looked at her own son and seen a weak, socially awkward target. She completely failed to realize that while she was busy underestimating his quiet nature, Leo was silently, meticulously observing every single detail of her destructive life. I took a deep breath of the freezing air and walked back across the cracked concrete of the motel parking lot. I unlocked the heavy wooden door and stepped inside the cramped, dark room. Leo was sitting upright on the edge of the stained mattress, staring blankly at the peeling floral wallpaper. I sat down in the plastic chair opposite him, knowing I was about to deliver a fatal blow to whatever remaining innocence he possessed. I spoke quietly, deliberately, telling him everything the private investigator had just uncovered. I explained the massive offshore insurance policy, the hidden corporate structure, and the horrifying romantic alliance between his mother and my absolute worst business rival. I braced myself, expecting him to completely shatter. I expected tears or a violent, explosive outburst of teenage grief. Instead, a profound, terrifying calmness settled over his young features. The quiet, frightened boy who had grabbed my arm at the airport terminal completely vanished. In his place sat a remarkably composed young man processing complex strategic data with absolute freezing precision. He did not cry. He looked me directly in the eyes and told me he was not entirely surprised by her betrayal. Leo slowly reached down and unlaced his muddy, ruined sneakers. He slipped his fingers beneath the worn foam insert of his left shoe and pulled out a small, sleek silver flash drive. The metallic surface caught the weak yellow light of the bedside lamp. I stared at the tiny object, completely confused by its sudden appearance. Leo held it up between his fingers and began to speak with a cold, clinical precision that perfectly mirrored my own professional contractor mindset. He explained that his suspicions about his mother had not started yesterday at the airport terminal. They had started weeks ago, right after I returned home from the hospital, recovering from my sudden heart attack. He had noticed a sudden, sharp shift in her daily digital behavior. She had abruptly installed military-grade encryption software on her personal laptop and began using a secured proxy server to route all her private internet traffic. To a normal person, these actions would be entirely invisible. To a brilliant young software engineer, they were massive, glowing red flags. Leo knew she was hiding something incredibly significant, but he needed absolute, undeniable proof. He told me that while I was busy loading her heavy leather suitcases into the trunk of the truck yesterday afternoon, he had deliberately slipped back inside the house under the pretense of using the restroom. He had actually gone straight into her locked home office. Valerie believed her digital security was entirely impenetrable because she had paid top dollar for the software. She did not realize her own son could bypass her complex firewalls in less than 3 minutes, using custom scripts he wrote in his bedroom. Leo had plugged that tiny silver flash drive into her private computer and initiated a rapid, forced cloning sequence. He had successfully copied the entire massive contents of her heavily encrypted hard drive right down to the hidden deleted files and the secured offshore banking application communication logs. He had pulled the drive out just seconds before she called for him to come downstairs. He had tucked it tightly into his shoe, completely unsure of what he had actually stolen, until he overheard her horrifying phone call later that evening regarding the fire. I reached out with a trembling hand and took the small silver drive from his palm. It weighed absolutely nothing, but it was the heaviest object I had ever held in my entire life. I looked at my son with a sudden, overwhelming surge of profound respect and deep fatherly pride. Valerie had meticulously stripped away my massive corporate bank accounts, my prime real estate holdings, and my entire physical identity. She thought she had left us with absolutely nothing but the clothes on our backs to die screaming in an orchestrated fire or to freeze silently in the dark margins of the world. She was spectacularly, tragically wrong. In her supreme, arrogant confidence, she had unknowingly allowed her own deeply underestimated son to walk out of the house carrying the absolute, undisputed digital blueprint of her entire criminal empire inside his worn-out shoe. This tiny piece of metal contained the offshore wire transfer routing receipts, the hidden blackmail chains with Trent Lawson, and the undeniable digital proof of the massive insurance fraud she was currently executing. She had willingly handed us the very weapon we desperately needed to completely dismantle her perfectly curated life. I gripped the flash drive tightly in my fist, feeling the sharp metallic edges press directly into my skin. The crushing, paralyzing despair that had haunted me since watching our home burn suddenly evaporated completely. We were no longer terrified, broken fugitives blindly running from a powerful, invisible ghost. Thanks to the brilliant, quiet boy sitting in front of me, We were now holding the tactical nuclear launch codes to destroy her. I looked at Leo and told him we were not going to hide in this rotting motel room anymore. We were going to war. The heavy rain hammered against the windshield of the truck as we drove away from the decaying motel, leaving our temporary prison behind. Mike Brody had instructed us to meet him at an abandoned-looking diner sitting on the edge of the county line. It was a miserable, forgotten structure surrounded by miles of empty fields, making it impossible for anyone to approach unseen. We pulled into the gravel parking lot and parked next to a nondescript dark gray sedan. I told Leo to keep his hood up as we sprinted through the freezing rain and pushed through the heavy glass doors of the diner. The interior smelled of old grease and stale coffee. The place was entirely empty except for Brody, who sat in the furthest corner booth facing the entrance. Sitting directly across from him was a woman I did not recognize. She wore a sharp, tailored black suit that looked entirely out of place in the grim surroundings. Her silver hair was pulled back tightly, and her eyes held the cold, calculating stare of a predator assessing its prey. Brody slid over and gestured for us to sit down. He introduced her simply as Sylvia Croft. Sylvia was not a typical family lawyer. She was a ruthless, aggressive corporate litigator who specialized in hostile takeovers and complex asset recovery. Brody explained that he had pulled her out of retirement specifically because she operated completely outside the wealthy elite social circles that Valerie currently dominated. Sylvia had no allegiances to the country club crowd, and she possessed a fierce reputation for destroying anyone who attempted to hide assets from her clients. She did not offer me a warm greeting or words of false sympathy regarding my current situation. She simply placed a thick, secure laptop on the sticky Formica table and opened the screen. She looked directly at Leo and asked for the digital weapon Brody had mentioned on the phone. Leo reached into his jacket pocket and placed the small silver flash drive onto the table. Sylvia picked it up with a pair of reading glasses, sliding it smoothly into the side port of her machine. Her fingers flew across the keyboard with rapid mechanical precision, initiating a secure offline viewing environment to ensure the digital footprint remained completely invisible. The screen illuminated the dark corner of the booth, casting a pale blue glow over our tired faces. I watched in heavy silence as Sylvia began to systematically unpack the dense encrypted folders Leo had extracted from my wife's private computer. The sheer volume of the data was staggering. It was not just a collection of illicit text messages or hidden bank statements. It was a comprehensive, meticulously structured corporate blueprint designed for absolute financial domination. Sylvia opened the first master file and began translating the complex legal jargon into brutal, undeniable reality. Valerie and Trent Lawson had not simply conspired to murder me for a $15 million insurance payout. That massive sum was merely the initial seed money intended to fund a much larger, far more sinister operation. Sylvia pointed to a series of heavily nested corporate registries, indicating that my wife had spent the last 6 months secretly transferring the foundational patents and the heavy equipment leases of my commercial contracting empire into a new shadow corporation. The betrayal ran so deep, it felt like the ground was collapsing beneath the diner booth. I had spent 40 years building my company from a single used pickup truck into a regional powerhouse. I knew the names of all my foremen, and I had personally negotiated every major municipal contract. Valerie and Trent had constructed a legal mechanism to essentially swallow my entire life's work the moment my death certificate was officially signed. Trent Lawson owned the commercial development permits, but he had recently filed for massive internal bankruptcy on several failing metropolitan projects. My company possessed the exact heavy machinery, the massive liquid capital, and the lucrative government contracts he desperately needed to save his crumbling empire. Valerie was effectively trading my life and my legacy to bail out her secret lover. In exchange, she would become a silent majority shareholder in his revitalized development firm, guaranteeing her absolute financial supremacy for the rest of her life. Sylvia clicked through the digital ledgers, exposing the agonizing details of their communication. We found drafted press releases stored on the drive, explicitly preparing the narrative for my tragic sudden passing. The documents outlined how Valerie would bravely step into my role as the grieving widow, relying heavily on the experienced, steady hand of our dear family friend, Trent Lawson, to manage the complex transition of the business. It was a flawless, airtight performance written and rehearsed while I was sleeping in the room next door. They had weaponized my recent medical vulnerability to convince my board of directors that I had recklessly mismanaged the company accounts during my physical decline. They had manufactured a complete fraudulent narrative of my impending financial ruin to ensure no one would question the sudden aggressive merger with Trent Lawson following my convenient demise. I sat frozen in the vinyl booth, listening to the relentless drumming of the rain against the diner window. The sheer magnitude of their premeditated malice was suffocating. They had calculated every single variable and manipulated every legal loophole. Sylvia leaned back against the red vinyl seat and closed the laptop screen with a soft, decisive click. She looked at me with a rare expression of grim respect. She stated clearly that if we had actually died in that fire, Valerie would have executed the most flawless corporate theft in the history of the state. The legal structures were so tightly bound and the offshore accounts so deeply buried that no standard police investigation would have ever connected the murder to the financial takeover. They had built an indestructible fortress of paper and lies. But Sylvia smiled coldly, a sharp, predatory grin that finally brought a tiny sliver of warmth to my frozen chest. She tapped her manicured finger against the silver flash drive resting on the table. She told me that their flawless, indestructible fortress had one critical, fatal flaw. They had assumed their victims would burn quietly in the night. Now that we possessed their complete master blueprint, we did not just have the power to stop them. We had the exact legal leverage required to completely obliterate them. My mind immediately shifted from survival to absolute coordinated retaliation. I was ready to authorize Sylvia to begin the counter-offensive when a sudden flash of bright color caught my eye from the opposite end of the dark room. My attention was violently pulled away from the glowing laptop screen by a sudden sharp spike in the volume of the small mounted television hanging above the pie display at the front counter. The local midday news broadcast had just returned from a commercial break, and the anchor was speaking with a grave, somber expression. Behind him, a large graphic flashed across the screen displaying the words, "Tragic Mystery" in bold red letters. My breath caught in my throat as the live camera feed cut directly to a sweeping drone shot of my property. The sprawling stone estate I had spent years designing and building was completely gone. In its place was a massive, smoking black crater of charred wood and collapsed slate. Fire investigators in bright yellow jackets were walking slowly through the smoking ruins, sifting through the wet gray ash with long metal poles. Seeing the absolute physical destruction of my home in the cold light of day was a heavy, terrible blow, but it was absolutely nothing compared to the psychological violence of what the television network broadcasted next. The news feed transitioned from the silent aerial view of the ruined house to a crowded, chaotic press conference being held right at the edge of our long, winding driveway. A large cluster of microphones from every major local and regional news syndicate was taped to a temporary wooden podium. Standing directly behind those microphones was my wife. Valerie looked absolutely flawless in her carefully orchestrated public grief. She wore a simple dark navy sweater and a tailored black overcoat, presenting the perfect image of a devastated but resilient matriarch facing an unimaginable tragedy. Her hair was slightly disheveled, just enough to suggest she had been awake all night, pacing and crying, but her makeup was expertly applied to emphasize her pale skin and her swollen red eyes. She gripped a silver-framed photograph of Leo and me tightly against her chest, like a physical shield against the harsh, terrifying world. She stepped up to the podium, and the camera zoomed in closely on her trembling lips. When she began to speak, her voice cracked with a masterful level of emotional precision that made my stomach physically churn with absolute disgust. She did not tell the reporters that her husband and her son had tragically perished in a terrible accidental house fire. The arsonists had obviously reported back to Trent Lawson that the house was completely empty when they poured the accelerant and lit the match. Valerie knew the fire marshals would not find any human remains in the ashes. Instead of panicking at the failed assassination, she had instantly and coldly pivoted her entire strategy, manufacturing an entirely new, horrifying narrative to explain our sudden absence. She looked directly into the television cameras and tearfully pleaded for the safe return of her family, claiming we had been brutally abducted. She told the captivated viewing audience a completely fabricated story about receiving a terrifying anonymous phone call threatening our lives just hours before the fire broke out. She spun a complex, brilliant web of lies, suggesting that dangerous, unknown individuals had kidnapped us in the middle of the night, and then burned the house down to destroy the physical evidence of the violent struggle. It was a terrifying performance of pure sociopathy. Sylvia Croft leaned forward, resting her elbows on the sticky diner table, and explained the dark, brilliant legal mechanism behind Valerie's televised tears. Without physical bodies recovered from the fire, Valerie would normally have to wait a mandatory 7 years for a civil judge to declare us legally dead in absentia. She could not possibly wait 7 years to claim the $15 million insurance payout and execute the corporate merger with Trent Lawson. By aggressively pushing the narrative of a violent kidnapping, accompanied by the total destruction of our home, she was deliberately establishing the legal groundwork for a declaration of extreme peril. This highly specific legal clause would allow her high-priced attorneys to petition a family court judge to declare us dead in a matter of weeks rather than years, expediting the massive payout almost immediately. She was actively manipulating the entire justice system, the local media, and the public consciousness to force the money out of the vault, while keeping her own hands completely clean. The television camera panned slightly to the right to reveal the man standing directly behind her, offering his silent, stoic support. It was Trent Lawson. He reached out and placed a comforting, protective hand on Valerie's shoulder, gently guiding her away from the microphones as she buried her face in her hands and began to sob hysterically for the cameras. He looked solemnly at the reporters and asked them to respect the privacy of the grieving family during this unimaginable nightmare. The sheer audacity of the televised scene was paralyzing. The man who had hired the hitmen to burn us alive was standing on my front lawn playing the role of the loyal, protective family friend, comforting the grieving widow he had secretly conspired with. I looked across the diner booth at Leo. He was staring at the television screen with cold, empty eyes, watching the woman who gave birth to him casually leverage his supposed kidnapping for a massive financial reward. The psychological blow of seeing her weep for our return while actively hunting us in secret was profoundly devastating. I realized in that exact moment that we were not simply fighting a greedy spouse or a corrupt business rival. We were going to war against a master manipulator who possessed the terrifying ability to bend reality completely to her will. I stared at the television screen until the local news anchor moved on to the next segment and the broadcast returned to mundane afternoon programming. Every single muscle in my body was completely locked with an aggressive, burning desire to stand up, walk out of the diner, and drive straight to the nearest state police barracks. I wanted to kick the heavy precinct doors open and declare to the entire world that I was alive. I wanted to watch federal agents place cold steel handcuffs on Valerie right in the middle of her meticulously staged press conference on our front lawn. I leaned aggressively across the sticky Formica table and told Mike Brody we needed to contact the authorities immediately. I pointed a trembling finger at the small silver flash drive resting near the laptop and stated loudly that we possessed the absolute, undeniable digital proof of her murder plot right there in our hands. Sylvia Croft did not nod in agreement. She did not reach into her designer handbag for her cellular phone to contact the district attorney. Instead, she calmly placed her palm flat over the silver flash drive and looked at me with an expression of absolute freezing pity. She spoke in a low, sharp tone that instantly cut through the thick, suffocating fog of my rising anger. She told me that walking into a police station right now would be the single most catastrophic mistake I could possibly make. I stared at her completely bewildered, demanding to know how exposing a cold-blooded murderer to the police could possibly be considered a mistake. Sylvia leaned in closer, her piercing gray eyes locking directly onto mine, and systematically dismantled my desperate, naive hope for swift, traditional justice. She explained with brutal clarity that the American criminal justice system was not designed to swiftly punish wealthy, brilliant sociopaths. It was designed to be a slow, grinding, bureaucratic machine that people like Valerie and Trent Lawson knew exactly how to manipulate. If I walked into a police precinct today, Valerie would immediately hire the most ruthless, expensive defense attorneys in the state, using my own stolen money to pay their exorbitant retainers. She would put on another flawless, weeping performance for the investigating detectives. She would masterfully claim that Trent Lawson had orchestrated the entire arson plot behind her back out of a deranged romantic obsession. She would claim she was entirely terrified for her own life and only played along with the horrific kidnapping narrative because she feared Trent would murder her next. With her pristine social reputation, her expensive tailored clothes, and her carefully crafted public tears, a jury might actually believe her lies. Even worse, Sylvia warned, while the criminal investigation dragged on for years, tied up in endless legal motions and jurisdictional disputes, Valerie would likely remain free on bail. She would retain total, absolute control over the offshore holding companies and my stolen commercial contracting empire. She would use the endless delays to quietly liquidate my heavy machinery, sell off my proprietary construction patents to foreign competitors, and launder the remaining millions through untraceable international accounts. By the time a judge finally ordered a criminal trial, my lifelong legacy would be completely reduced to ash, and Valerie would have safely relocated to a non-extradition country, living like absolute royalty on my blood money. Sylvia made it terrifyingly clear that the police could only arrest her for the fire, but they completely lacked the sophisticated tactical speed to stop the massive corporate theft currently underway. I sat back heavily against the red vinyl diner booth, letting her cold, brutal logic wash over me. The bitter pill was incredibly hard to swallow, but its truth was completely undeniable. I looked at Leo, who was sitting silently beside me, absorbing the grim, terrifying reality of our new situation. We could not rely on a detective with a badge to save our lives or rescue our future. If we wanted true, absolute justice, we had to completely bypass the traditional legal system. I looked back at the fierce attorney and slowly nodded my head. I verbally accepted the terrifying necessity of remaining legally missing. I agreed to let the world believe that James Callahan and his young son were completely gone. By staying dead to the public, we retained the one ultimate tactical advantage that Valerie could never possibly anticipate. We were completely unpredictable, invisible ghosts. Once I fully accepted our status as dead men, Sylvia immediately shifted the atmosphere of the covert meeting from defensive survival to aggressive, calculated warfare. She opened a new blank document on her encrypted laptop and told me it was time to draft a precise, ruthless counteroffensive. We were not going to simply punch Valerie in the face or expose her on the evening news. We were going to systematically destroy the absolute foundation of the infrastructure she had built with Trent Lawson. Sylvia explained that Trent was the critical weak link in their dark romantic alliance. He was a man driven by massive, fragile ego and heavily leveraged by terrifying levels of corporate debt. His commercial real estate development empire was essentially a towering house of cards, completely dependent on the sudden influx of my stolen capital to keep from collapsing under the heavy weight of his angry, impatient creditors. Sylvia proposed a brilliant, invisible financial strategy. We would not attack Valerie directly, where her legal defenses were currently fortified by overwhelming public sympathy. Instead, we would use the stolen digital blueprint on the flash drive to map out every single one of Trent Lawson's toxic, failing commercial loans. We were going to aggressively attack his financial supply lines from the deep shadows. Sylvia had direct access to aggressive independent corporate holding firms that operated entirely off the public radar. She outlined a complex, brilliant plan to use those anonymous shell companies to legally and quietly purchase the massive debt notes on Trent's most critical development projects. We would become his absolute financial masters without his knowledge. We would let Valerie believe she had successfully stolen my empire, while we systematically built an invisible legal cage entirely around them. When the trap finally snapped shut, they would not just go to prison. They would lose every single dollar, every piece of property, and every ounce of social power they had ever possessed. I looked at the glowing laptop screen mapping out our silent financial war and felt a cold, sharp smile finally form on my face. I stared at the television screen until the local news anchor moved on to the next segment, and the broadcast returned to mundane afternoon programming. Every single muscle in my body was completely locked with an aggressive, burning desire to stand up, walk out of the diner, and drive straight to the nearest state police barracks. I wanted to kick the heavy precinct doors open and declare to the entire world that I was alive. I wanted to watch federal agents place cold steel handcuffs on Valerie right in the middle of her meticulously staged press conference on our front lawn. I leaned aggressively across the sticky Formica table and told Mike Brody we needed to contact the authorities immediately. I pointed a trembling finger at the small silver flash drive resting near the laptop and stated loudly that we possessed the absolute undeniable digital proof of her murder plot right there in our hands. Sylvia Croft did not nod in agreement. She did not reach into her designer handbag for her cellular phone to contact the district attorney. Instead, she calmly placed her palm flat over the silver flash drive and looked at me with an expression of absolute freezing pity. She spoke in a low, sharp tone that instantly cut through the thick, suffocating fog of my rising anger. She told me that walking into a police station right now would be the single most catastrophic mistake I could possibly make. I stared at her completely bewildered, demanding to know how exposing a cold-blooded murderer to the police could possibly be considered a mistake. Sylvia leaned in closer, her piercing gray eyes locking directly onto mine, and systematically dismantled my desperate, naive hope for swift, traditional justice. She explained with brutal clarity that the American criminal justice system was not designed to swiftly punish wealthy, brilliant sociopaths. It was designed to be a slow, grinding, bureaucratic machine that people like Valerie and Trent Lawson knew exactly how to manipulate. If I walked into a police precinct today, Valerie would immediately hire the most ruthless, expensive defense attorneys in the state, using my own stolen money to pay their exorbitant retainers. She would put on another flawless, weeping performance for the investigating detectives. She would masterfully claim that Trent Lawson had orchestrated the entire arson plot behind her back out of a deranged romantic obsession. She would claim she was entirely terrified for her own life and only played along with the horrific kidnapping narrative because she feared Trent would murder her next. With her pristine social reputation, her expensive tailored clothes, and her carefully crafted public tears, a jury might actually believe her lies. Even worse, Sylvia warned, while the criminal investigation dragged on for years, tied up in endless legal motions and jurisdictional disputes, Valerie would likely remain free on bail. She would retain total, absolute control over the offshore holding companies and my stolen commercial contracting empire. She would use the endless delays to quietly liquidate my heavy machinery, sell off my proprietary construction patents to foreign competitors, and launder the remaining millions through untraceable international accounts. By the time a judge finally ordered a criminal trial, my lifelong legacy would be completely reduced to ash, and Valerie would have safely relocated to a non-extradition country, living like absolute royalty on my blood money. Sylvia made it terrifyingly clear that the police could only arrest her for the fire, but they completely lacked the sophisticated tactical speed to stop the massive corporate theft currently underway. I sat back heavily against the red vinyl diner booth, letting her cold, brutal logic wash over me. The bitter pill was incredibly hard to swallow, but its truth was completely undeniable. I looked at Leo, who was sitting silently beside me, absorbing the grim, terrifying reality of our new situation. We could not rely on a detective with a badge to save our lives or rescue our future. If we wanted true, absolute justice, we had to completely bypass the traditional legal system. I looked back at the fierce attorney and slowly nodded my head. I verbally accepted the terrifying necessity of remaining legally missing. I agreed to let the world believe that James Callahan and his young son were completely gone. By staying dead to the public, we retained the one ultimate tactical advantage that Valerie could never possibly anticipate. We were completely unpredictable, invisible ghosts. Once I fully accepted our status as dead men, Sylvia immediately shifted the atmosphere of the covert meeting from defensive survival to aggressive, calculated warfare. She opened a new blank document on her encrypted laptop and told me it was time to draft a precise, ruthless counter-offensive. We were not going to simply punch Valerie in the face or expose her on the evening news. We were going to systematically destroy the absolute foundation of the infrastructure she had built with Trent Lawson. Sylvia explained that Trent was the critical weak link in their dark romantic alliance. He was a man driven by massive, fragile ego and heavily leveraged by terrifying levels of corporate debt. His commercial real estate development empire was essentially a towering house of cards, completely dependent on the sudden influx of my stolen capital to keep from collapsing under the heavy weight of his angry, impatient creditors. Sylvia proposed a brilliant, invisible financial strategy. We would not attack Valerie directly where her legal defenses were currently fortified by overwhelming public sympathy. Instead, we would use the stolen digital blueprint on the flash drive to map out every single one of Trent Lawson's toxic, failing commercial loans. We were going to aggressively attack his financial supply lines from the deep shadows. Sylvia had direct access to aggressive, independent corporate holding firms that operated entirely off the public radar. She outlined a complex, brilliant plan to use those anonymous shell companies to legally and quietly purchase the massive debt notes on Trent's most critical development projects. We would become his absolute financial masters without his knowledge. We would let Valerie believe she had successfully stolen my empire, while we systematically built an invisible legal cage entirely around them. When the trap finally snapped shut, they would not just go to prison. They would lose every single dollar, every piece of property, and every ounce of social power they had ever possessed. I looked at the glowing laptop screen mapping out our silent financial war and felt a cold, sharp smile finally form on my face. Sylvia pushed the silver flash drive to the side of her laptop keyboard and looked at me with a perfectly level stare. She asked the most critical question of the entire operation. She wanted to know exactly how we were supposed to finance a massive invisible corporate war when my wife had successfully drained every single penny from our joint checking accounts, our family trust, and the primary operating ledgers of my commercial contracting firm. A slow, dark smile crept across my face for the very first time since I watched my living room explode into flames. Valerie was a brilliant manipulator, but her fatal flaw was her absolute blinding arrogance. She genuinely believed that the man she married 25 years ago was simply a lucky local contractor who stumbled into suburban wealth. She thought the sprawling stone estate, the luxury cars, and the active corporate bank accounts represented the complete totality of my financial existence. She only knew the comfortable, domesticated version of James Callahan. She had absolutely no idea who I was before I put a gold wedding band on my finger. I leaned across the sticky diner table and instructed Sylvia to close the files containing my stolen active accounts. I told her to open a secure encrypted browser and type in a specific sequence of heavily masked web addresses. I began to drip feed the absolute truth about my financial history to the ruthless attorney and my wide-eyed son. Long before I ever met Valerie, I was a fiercely ambitious and incredibly paranoid young man, pouring concrete and laying steel in the most dangerous industrial sectors of the city. I built my initial fortune in my late 20s during a period of massive urban expansion. I learned very early on that visible wealth is a massive target for lawsuits, corrupt politicians, and greedy partners. By the time I turned 35, I had already accumulated a massive amount of foundational capital, but I absolutely refused to leave it exposed in standard commercial banks. I hired paranoid legal architects to construct an invisible financial fortress, completely insulated from any future personal liabilities or civil disputes. I directed Sylvia to log into a series of highly obscure corporate registries located in Delaware and Wyoming. These were states that offered absolute ironclad corporate anonymity. I had established a complex, interlocking web of dormant shell companies and blind trusts over 3 decades ago. I deliberately gave these entities incredibly boring administrative names that would never attract a second glance from an auditor or a suspicious spouse. I named them things like Apex Industrial Holdings and Valley Municipal Land Rights. Valerie never knew these massive corporate entities existed because they never generated standard monthly bank statements sent to our home address. They did not hold liquid cash or fund our extravagant suburban lifestyle. They held raw, invisible foundational assets. They owned the actual dirt beneath several major industrial parks on the eastern seaboard. They held massive portfolios of slow-yielding municipal bonds that had been quietly compounding interest for over 30 years. They owned lucrative long-term commercial land leases that paid dividends directly into encrypted anonymous offshore accounts, completely separate from the joint family trust Valerie had so meticulously drained. Sylvia typed the complex security credentials I provided into her laptop. The screen flashed and then loaded a massive, sprawling digital map of my hidden empire. I watched the ruthless attorney actually gasp as the sheer magnitude of the hidden capital populated on her screen. There were tens of millions of dollars resting in absolute silence, completely untouched by my wife's greedy hands. Valerie had essentially spent months carefully picking the locks on the front door of my house to steal the silver, while remaining completely unaware of the massive, uncrackable gold vault buried deep beneath the foundation. She thought she had left me completely destitute and defenseless. Instead, she had simply forced me to unlock the absolute heaviest weapons in my arsenal. I looked at Leo, who was staring at the glowing screen with absolute profound shock. He finally understood that his father was not just a victim of a cruel betrayal, but a highly calculated architect who had built a financial fail-safe for exactly this kind of catastrophic betrayal. Sylvia immediately recognized the terrifying power of the invisible capital sitting on her screen. Her legal mind began operating at a breathtaking speed. She outlined exactly how we were going to weaponize these hidden shell companies to completely suffocate Trent Lawson without ever showing our faces. Trent was currently celebrating his massive influx of stolen capital, completely unaware that he was still heavily bleeding from his previous corporate failures. He possessed a massive portfolio of toxic, high-interest mezzanine debt attached to 3 failed commercial skyscrapers downtown. His creditors were circling him like hungry sharks, ready to tear his development empire to pieces. Sylvia explained that we would not attack him directly. We would use my anonymous Wyoming holding companies to quietly and aggressively approach his desperate creditors in the middle of the night. We would offer to buy the massive debt notes on his failing projects for pennies on the dollar entirely in cash. The sheer brilliant cruelty of the strategy was intoxicating. Trent Lawson would wake up one morning and receive a formal legal notice that his massive corporate debts had been successfully purchased by a faceless, out-of-state hedge fund. He would assume it was simply a standard aggressive financial maneuver by a random corporate entity looking to restructure his loans. He would never in a million years suspect that the anonymous corporate master pulling his financial leash was the very man he had tried to burn alive just weeks prior. We were going to let him continue building his massive new commercial empire using the money Valerie stole from my active accounts. We would let them pour millions of dollars into new concrete and steel. We would wait patiently in the dark shadows while they tied all their newly stolen wealth directly into his vulnerable development projects. And then, the exact moment they felt completely safe and victorious, we would emerge from the shadows and legally foreclose on every single piece of property they owned. We were not just going to take our money back. We were going to legally own every single thing Trent Lawson and my wife had ever built. The invisible financial war had officially begun, and I was holding the ultimate undisputed winning hand. The heavy rain continued to hammer against the diner window, but the cold, damp chill had completely vanished from my bones. I was no longer a terrified old man running blindly through the dark woods. I was a fully funded corporate ghost, preparing to execute the most devastating financial ambush in the history of the city. I told Sylvia to initiate the silent asset transfers immediately. I wanted the dormant accounts fully activated and heavily weaponized before the morning sun rose. We had a massive empire to systematically destroy, and we were going to do it completely by the book. We left the diner an hour later and drove to a nondescript corporate hotel near the city limits. I paid for a suite in cash for a week, providing Sylvia with a secure location to establish our digital war room. She set up her encrypted network and immediately began the highly complex process of unleashing my dormant capital. I watched her work with the speed and precision of a seasoned military commander. She initiated a series of rapid wire transfers, moving massive blocks of capital from my anonymous Wyoming trusts into several aggressively structured proxy investment firms. These proxy firms were entirely untraceable paper entities that existed solely to execute rapid financial acquisitions without ever revealing the true source of the money. By the time the sun set on our first day in hiding, my invisible army was fully mobilized and heavily armed with millions of dollars in liquid cash. Sylvia shifted her focus to Trent Lawson and his crumbling empire. She pulled up the public financial records and the private credit reports that Mike Brody had quietly procured. Trent was a man drowning in his own grand ambitions. He had leveraged his entire personal fortune to finance 3 massive commercial developments across the metropolitan area. His crown jewel was a towering luxury residential complex downtown that was currently sitting half-finished and completely stalled due to severe supply chain mismanagement and gross financial incompetence. He owed 3 massive private equity firms a staggering amount of high-interest mezzanine debt. Those aggressive creditors were preparing to completely butcher him. They were weeks away from seizing his properties and liquidating his entire firm. Trent was desperately relying on the massive influx of cash Valerie had stolen from my accounts to pay off those angry creditors and save his legacy. He believed the stolen millions would buy him a fresh start and complete financial salvation. He was absolutely wrong. Sylvia did not wait for Trent to make his move. She preemptively contacted the 3 private equity firms holding his massive debt notes. She presented herself as the lead negotiator for a ruthless, out-of-state hedge fund looking to aggressively expand its local real estate portfolio. She offered them a brutal but highly attractive deal. She proposed to purchase the entirety of Trent Lawson and his toxic debt for 70 cents on the dollar, paid entirely in clean, untraceable cash within 24 hours. The private equity managers did not hesitate for a single second. They were absolutely thrilled to dump the massive financial liability and immediately recoup a significant portion of their failing investment. They did not care who was buying the paper as long as the check cleared. Over the course of the next 72 hours, I sat in the dim hotel room and watched Sylvia execute the most brilliant corporate slaughter I had ever witnessed. She aggressively acquired the primary mortgage on his half-finished luxury tower. She purchased the heavy construction liens on his stalled suburban shopping district. She bought out the massive high-interest bridging loans he had desperately secured to keep his payroll afloat. Every single time a greedy creditor signed a transfer agreement, another massive piece of his empire quietly shifted into my absolute control. I was essentially buying his financial soul piece by broken piece from the deep shadows. Trent Lawson went to sleep at night, believing he was a brilliant criminal mastermind who had successfully stolen my life and secured his own future. He had absolutely no idea that while he was pouring champagne with my wife to celebrate my supposed death, I had secretly become his absolute financial master. The sheer psychological satisfaction of the silent acquisition was profoundly intoxicating. I was no longer a victim seeking simple revenge. I was the invisible architect of their complete destruction. Valerie and Trent were currently using my stolen money to slowly restart the stalled construction on his luxury properties. They were blindly pouring millions of dollars of my own stolen capital directly into the foundation of buildings that I now legally owned. They were essentially paying me to build my own real estate empire, while mistakenly believing they were securing their own wealth. I controlled the exact terms of their loans. I controlled the strict maturity dates on their massive debt notes. I possessed the absolute legal authority to demand full immediate repayment the very second they violated a single obscure clause in those contracts. I had successfully woven an invisible, unbreakable net completely around them, and they were currently tying the final knots around their own necks. Leo sat in the corner of the hotel suite watching the complex legal maneuvering with quiet, intense fascination. He was witnessing a masterclass in silent tactical warfare. I took the time to explain the intricate details of the financial trap to him, ensuring he understood exactly how we were systematically disarming the people who tried to murder us. I wanted him to see that true power does not come from loud public outbursts or violent physical confrontation. True power lies in the quiet, meticulous control of leverage and information. He absorbed every single word, nodding slowly, as he realized the absolute genius of our strategy. He had provided the initial digital weapon, and now he was watching his father wield it with devastating precision. As Sylvia finalized the last massive debt acquisition, we turned our attention back to the local news broadcasts. Valerie was continuing her spectacular public performance. She organized a candlelight vigil in the center of the city park, holding hands with Trent Lawson as they wept together for the cameras. She gave heartbreaking interviews to prominent journalists, describing the terrible, agonizing pain of not knowing where her husband and son were located. She used the massive public sympathy to aggressively pressure the family court system, demanding an expedited hearing to declare us legally dead. She argued that the frozen estate funds were desperately needed to hire private investigators and maintain the massive corporate responsibilities I had supposedly left behind. It was a sickening, brilliant display of manipulation. Watching her weep crocodile tears on the television screen while I held the absolute legal ownership of her new secret life was a surreal, deeply empowering experience. She thought she was maneuvering the entire city like pawns on a chessboard. She failed to realize that we were no longer playing her game. We had completely bought the chessboard, the table it rested on, and the very room she was sitting in. The financial noose was now pulled perfectly tight. We had successfully secured every single piece of toxic debt and established absolute dominance over their entire combined empire. The preparation phase of our silent war was finally complete. The invisible trap was fully loaded and secured. I told Sylvia to pack up the encrypted laptop and prepare the final legal briefs. It was finally time to make our grand resurrection and show my wife exactly what happens when you try to burn the devil in his own house. While Sylvia Croft remained locked inside the secure hotel suite, finalizing the massive corporate foreclosure documents, Mike Brody shifted his absolute focus back to the physical streets. We had successfully trapped Trent Lawson in an inescapable financial cage, but we still desperately needed concrete physical evidence of the murder-for-hire plot to legally destroy Valerie. We needed the men who lit the match. I sat across from Brody at the small glass table in the hotel room and watched him prepare for the hunt. During our terrifying escape through the freezing woods, Leo had proven his brilliant observation skills yet again. While I had been entirely paralyzed by the horrifying sight of the men breaking into our home, my son had remained perfectly still and focused his eyes directly on the black utility van parked in our driveway. The vehicle had no official license plates mounted on the bumpers, but Leo had noticed a faint temporary registration tag taped to the inside corner of the heavily tinted windshield. He had mentally locked onto the alphanumeric sequence recording 7 distinct digits before the flames erupted and the men sped away. He recited those 7 digits to Brody with absolute unwavering certainty. Brody did not enter those numbers into a standard police database. If he used a municipal terminal to run the partial plates, it would immediately create a digital footprint that a corrupt detective or a paid informant on Trent Lawson's payroll might easily discover. Brody operated entirely within the dangerous gray shadows of the city. He pulled a heavy encrypted tablet from his duffel bag and accessed a secure private network used exclusively by high-level corporate security firms and elite bounty hunters. He ran the alphanumeric sequence through a series of proprietary algorithms cross-referencing the digits with stolen vehicle reports, illegal chop shop registries, and known associate databases. The search required profound patience and a deep understanding of how professional criminals attempt to erase their tracks. Brody sat motionless for hours, watching strings of raw data scroll across the dark screen. His eyes were cold and perfectly focused, reflecting the methodical, relentless nature of a man who had spent his entire life hunting dangerous prey in the concrete jungle. Late in the evening, the proprietary algorithm finally triggered a silent alert. The system found a direct match for the temporary registration tag. The black utility van was not a phantom vehicle. It had been legally purchased 3 weeks prior under a completely fraudulent corporate name from a shady independent dealership located in the deepest, most derelict industrial sector of the city. Brody grabbed his heavy leather jacket and checked the loaded magazine of his matte black pistol. He told me to stay inside the locked hotel suite with Leo and keep my phone close. He was going into the darkest corners of the criminal underbelly, and he was going alone. I paced the floor of the hotel room for the next 4 hours, listening to the rain continue to beat against the heavy glass windows. The wait was an agonizing exercise in psychological endurance. Brody was currently navigating a dangerous labyrinth of rusted shipping containers, abandoned textile warehouses, and illegal automotive garages. He did not ask questions like a polite police officer. He used his massive physical presence and his terrifying reputation to extract immediate answers from the men who operated in those shadows. He visited a notorious chop shop where stolen luxury cars were stripped for parts in the middle of the night. He cornered a low-level informant who owed him a massive favor, pressing him aggressively for any whispers regarding a high-priced arson contract executed in the wealthy suburbs. He systematically tightened his grip around the local criminal network, forcing the rats to scatter and reveal their hiding places. He moved through the flooded alleys and the broken streets with the silent precision of a ghost, ignoring the cold rain soaking through his clothes. Shortly after midnight, my cheap, prepaid phone vibrated aggressively on the glass table. I answered the call and heard the heavy rhythmic sound of industrial machinery humming loudly in the background. Brody spoke in a low, tight whisper that carried a terrifying edge of absolute victory. He had successfully tracked the black utility van to an abandoned subterranean parking garage located directly beneath a condemned commercial plaza on the south side of the city. He had breached the perimeter and observed the vehicle sitting in the damp shadows, smelling heavily of chemical accelerant and stale cigarette smoke. More importantly, he had located the men. They were currently sitting inside a makeshift office constructed from chained link fencing and dirty plastic tarps, drinking cheap beer, and entirely unaware that the ghost of the man they had supposedly burned alive was actively hunting them. Brody told me he had a perfect visual confirmation on the taller man who threw the lighter onto my living room floor. He did not ask for my permission to make the next move. He simply stated that he was going to acquire the final piece of our puzzle and ended the call. I stood in the quiet hotel room, feeling a cold, dark thrill wash over my entire body. The physical trap was about to spring shut with violent, terrifying force. Brody later recounted every single detail of the violent confrontation that took place deep inside that crumbling subterranean garage. He did not bother waiting for police backup, because involving the authorities would completely destroy our silent advantage. He simply walked out of the shadows and approached the makeshift chain-link office where the two hired killers were celebrating their supposed victory. The heavy concrete walls of the underground structure amplified the sound of his thick leather boots striking the damp pavement. He did not try to mask his approach. He wanted them to hear him coming. The taller man who had casually tossed the lighter into my living room stood up from a folding chair, and reached for a weapon resting on a dirty plastic table. He was entirely too slow. Brody did not announce himself or read them their legal rights. He simply kicked the aluminum frame of the makeshift door with such massive physical force that it completely tore off its rusted hinges and crashed directly into the shorter man sitting on a milk crate. The shorter man collapsed onto the concrete floor, instantly incapacitated by the heavy metal frame. The taller man raised a heavy steel wrench, but Brody was already inside the confined space. Brody moved with the terrifying practiced violence of a man who had spent decades surviving in the absolute worst environments on Earth. He deflected the wrench with his thick forearm and delivered a single devastating blow to the chest of the taller man. The sickening crack of bone echoed loudly in the damp garage. The arsonist dropped the wrench and fell to his knees, gasping violently for air that his lungs could no longer process. Brody stepped forward and grabbed the terrified man by the collar of his dark tactical shirt. He dragged him effortlessly across the rough concrete floor and slammed his back against a thick, structural pillar. Brody pulled a heavy black digital audio recorder from his jacket pocket and pressed the record button. He held the device inches from the bleeding face of the hired killer. Brody did not raise his voice or scream threats. He spoke in a low, dead, calm tone that completely froze the blood in the criminal. He told the gasping man that the massive house fire in the wealthy suburbs did not go exactly as planned. He revealed that James Callahan and his young son were not asleep in their beds when the accelerant was poured. He stated clearly that the primary targets had completely escaped the inferno and were currently watching every single move the arsonists made. The taller man stared up at Brody with wide, terrified eyes as the horrifying realization finally set in. He realized he had not committed a clean, untraceable accident. He had completely botched a high-profile assassination, and the victims were now actively hunting him in the dark. Brody leaned his massive frame closer and presented the brutal, inescapable ultimatum. He explained that the local police and the federal investigators were currently tearing the city apart, looking for the monsters who supposedly kidnapped and murdered a prominent wealthy family. Brody offered the bleeding man two distinct choices. The first choice was absolute destruction. Brody promised that if the man remained silent, he would personally drag both of them out of that garage and deliver them directly to the front steps of the most aggressive federal prosecutor in the state. He would hand over the fraudulent vehicle registration, the detailed financial records of the wire transfers, and the undeniable physical evidence linking them directly to the arson. He promised they would both take the absolute maximum fall for a premeditated double homicide and a high-profile kidnapping. They would spend the rest of their miserable lives rotting inside a maximum security prison, taking the entire blame while their wealthy employer remained completely free and untouched. The arsonist swallowed hard, his breathing ragged and uneven, as the crushing weight of a life sentence settled heavily onto his shoulders. Then Brody offered the second choice. He told the man that he did not actually care about punishing the low-level soldiers who merely lit the match. He only wanted the wealthy, arrogant architect who ordered the strike. If the arsonist surrendered the exact name of his employer and provided the direct communication channels used to orchestrate the hit, Brody promised to let them walk away from the garage alive. He promised to give them a 3-hour head start to completely disappear from the city before the police ever knew they existed. It was not a difficult decision for a hired criminal facing absolute ruin. There is absolutely no honor among thieves, especially when a life behind steel bars is the only alternative. The taller man coughed up a thin stream of blood and nodded his head frantically. He desperately agreed to surrender absolutely everything he knew. He reached into his tactical vest with a shaking hand and pulled out a cheap, disposable cellular phone. He handed the plastic device to Brody and confessed his complete involvement directly into the glowing digital audio recorder. He stated his own name clearly and then outlined the exact details of the contract. He confessed that a wealthy corporate developer named Trent Lawson had paid them a massive cash advance to burn the Callahan estate to the ground, and ensure no one survived the flames. He provided the specific burner phone number Trent Lawson used to arrange the hit and coordinate the final payment. He admitted that Trent had called them just hours ago, panicking about the missing bodies and demanding they lay low until the insurance money was fully cleared. Brody stood up from the concrete floor and secured the digital audio recorder back into his jacket pocket. He had successfully extracted the absolute undeniable proof we needed to completely destroy them. He dropped the cheap cellular phone into his pocket, turned his back on the bleeding men, and walked out of the dark underground garage. He left them terrified and broken in the shadows, while he returned to the hotel with the final weapon. Mike Brody walked back into the dimly lit hotel suite just before 2 a.m, dripping wet from the heavy rain. He did not say a single word as he crossed the room. He simply reached into the deep pocket of his leather jacket and tossed a small piece of dark plastic onto the center of the glass dining table. The cheap, disposable cellular phone clattered loudly against the glass, breaking the heavy silence of the room. I stared at the scratched surface of the device, feeling a sudden, massive surge of adrenaline pump through my exhausted veins. This tiny, insignificant piece of plastic was the absolute holy grail of our entire investigation. Brody pulled out his digital audio recorder and set it down right next to the phone. He looked at me with a grim, exhausted smile and announced that the taller arsonist had completely broken under the physical pressure. The hired killer had confessed to the entire murder-for-hire plot on tape, but more importantly, he had surrendered the exact communication device used to coordinate the lethal strike. I slowly reached out and picked up the burner phone. It felt incredibly light in the palm of my hand, but it carried the heavy, undeniable weight of a double homicide conspiracy. For the last several days, we had possessed a massive mountain of digital financial evidence, but we desperately lacked the physical bridge connecting the violent arson directly to the quiet corporate theft. My wife and Trent Lawson had operated behind thick walls of corporate anonymity and encrypted offshore applications. They believed they were completely insulated from the dirty physical reality of the men they hired to pour the toxic accelerant. But arrogant criminals always make one fatal mistake. Trent Lawson had been entirely too paranoid to use a professional middleman for the final payment instructions. He had directly dialed this exact cheap prepaid phone to panic about the missing bodies and to demand the hitmen remain completely hidden. Leo immediately understood the massive tactical value of the physical device I was holding. He stood up from his chair and gently took the phone from my hands. He carried it over to the wooden desk where Sylvia Croft had left her secure, encrypted laptop running. Leo pulled a small bundle of diagnostic cables from his backpack and connected the cheap cellular phone directly to the high-powered machine. His fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing the rudimentary security lock on the prepaid device in a matter of seconds. He accessed the internal memory board and extracted the complete incoming and outgoing call logs. The screen populated with a short list of dialed numbers and time-stamped durations. Leo isolated the specific 10-digit phone number that had contacted the arsonists repeatedly on the exact night our house was burned to the ground. He highlighted the number in bright yellow on the dark monitor. We still needed absolute, undeniable proof that the highlighted number belonged exclusively to Trent Lawson. Sylvia Croft stepped forward and took control of the keyboard. She opened the massive cloned database that Leo had successfully extracted from the private computer belonging to my wife. She ran a complex cross-reference search, programming the software to scan every single hidden text message, encrypted email, and secure proxy communication log for that exact 10-digit numerical sequence. We held our collective breath as the processing bar crawled slowly across the screen. Less than a minute later, the system chimed with a perfect, direct match. The secret burner number Trent used to hire the arsonists was the exact same secure line he used to intimately message my wife regarding their impending corporate merger. The final physical link in the chain was completely established. We now possessed the audio confession, the financial motive, and the direct communication logs tying the arson plot directly to their secret romantic alliance. The legal trap was completely airtight. There was absolutely no room for alternative narratives or high-priced defense lawyer technicalities. I looked at the glowing screen and knew with absolute certainty that Trent Lawson and my wife had successfully engineered their own complete destruction. The digital clock on the bedside table glowed with a harsh red light, indicating it was exactly 3 in the morning. The heavy rain had finally stopped, but a thick, suffocating fog had rolled over the city streets. I sat in the dark hotel room holding the cheap burner phone we had extracted from the arsonist. My son Leo was asleep in the adjacent room, finally resting after days of pure adrenaline and fear. Sylvia Croft had returned to her own suite, leaving me completely alone to execute this precise psychological strike. I stared at the plastic device, feeling the immense power it held. Trent Lawson was currently asleep in his luxury penthouse across the city, probably dreaming about the massive commercial empire he was building with my stolen money. He believed he was completely untouchable, shielded by his wealth and his ruthless arrogance. It was time to introduce him to the terrifying reality of the ghost he had created. I slowly punched his private 10-digit cellular number into the keypad. This was the exact secure line he used to orchestrate my murder. I pressed the small green call button and raised the speaker to my ear. The line rang once, sounding incredibly loud in the absolute silence of the hotel room. On the third ring, the connection clicked open. I could hear the faint rustling of expensive silk sheets and the heavy, uneven breathing of a man abruptly pulled from a deep sleep. Trent answered the phone with a low, irritated grunt. He did not say his name. He simply demanded to know why they were calling him on this secure line at this hour. His voice was thick with sleep and heavy with the arrogant annoyance of a man who firmly believed he was speaking to his hired criminal subordinates. He expected the arsonists to be calling him with an update on their hiding location or demanding another wire transfer to keep their mouths shut. He had absolutely no idea that the man listening to his voice on the other end of the line was the very man he had paid them to incinerate. I did not say a single word. I maintained an absolute dead silence, allowing the cold, empty air to stretch between us for 5 agonizing seconds. Trent shifted uncomfortably on his end of the line. His voice lost a fraction of its arrogance and gained a slight edge of confusion as he repeated his demand for an answer, louder this time. I reached over to the glass table and picked up the black digital audio recorder Mike Brody had brought back from the subterranean garage. I held the small speaker directly against the microphone of the burner phone. I pressed the play button with my thumb. The rough, terrified voice of the taller arsonist suddenly blasted across the cellular connection, cutting through the quiet night with devastating clarity. The recording captured the absolute raw fear in the hired killer as he gasped for air and confessed to the entire horrific plot. Trent Lawson listened in complete paralyzed silence as the man he hired admitted that the assassination attempt at the Callahan estate was a spectacular failure. The recording played the exact moment the arsonist confessed that the house was completely empty when the toxic accelerant was poured. He listened to his own hired gun explicitly state that James Callahan and his son were alive and actively hunting them in the dark. But the absolute fatal blow came in the final 10 seconds of the audio clip. The recording echoed with the devastating sound of the arsonist clearly stating Trent Lawson by his full legal name, identifying him as the wealthy corporate developer who had financed the hit and orchestrated the entire conspiracy. I stopped the playback right as the audio file ended. The absolute deafening silence returned to the cellular connection, but the atmosphere had completely, fundamentally changed. I pressed the phone back against my ear to listen to the immediate aftermath of the psychological bomb I had just detonated. The arrogant, annoyed developer was completely gone. In his place was a man experiencing sheer, absolute terror. I could hear Trent Lawson gasping for air, his breath coming in short, frantic bursts that mirrored the edge of a massive panic attack. He knocked something heavy off his nightstand in the dark, and the object shattered loudly against the hardwood floor. He stammered frantically into the receiver, demanding to know who was on the line. He begged the silent ghost to speak, offering massive sums of cash and promising anything I wanted if I would just negotiate an arrangement. His voice cracked with the pathetic, desperate pitch of a cornered animal realizing the trap had just violently snapped shut over its neck. He knew the police were not calling him. The police do not play anonymous audio confessions at 3 in the morning. He knew in his dark, terrified heart exactly who was holding the phone. I listened to him hyperventilate and beg for another full minute, absorbing every single ounce of his agonizing fear. I did not give him the satisfaction of hearing my voice. I did not offer him a single word of explanation. I simply pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button, completely terminating the connection. I dropped the cheap plastic device back onto the glass table and sat back in the dark hotel room. The psychological torture was perfectly executed. Trent Lawson was now wide awake, trapped in his luxurious penthouse, entirely consumed by the horrifying knowledge that his perfect crime was completely exposed and his victims were coming for him. I knew with absolute calculated certainty that a man possessed by that level of raw, suffocating panic would be physically incapable of keeping the secret to himself. His massive, fragile ego would completely shatter under the extreme pressure of the unknown threat. He was going to make a catastrophic mistake before the sun ever came up. He was going to reach out to the only other person involved in the conspiracy and call my wife. I placed the burner phone back onto the glass table and watched Mike Brody open his heavy black laptop. He had anticipated Trent Lawson breaking under the psychological pressure. During the hours we spent analyzing the cloned hard drive, Brody had quietly installed a highly sophisticated digital trap. He had routed the secure communication frequencies used by my wife and her secret partner through a covert proxy server. This meant that the moment Trent panicked and tried to call Valerie, the audio signal would bypass their expensive encryption software and stream directly into our hotel room. We did not have to wait long for the trap to spring. Less than 2 minutes after I abruptly terminated my silent psychological strike, the digital audio interface on Brody's screen illuminated with a bright, flashing red indicator. Trent Lawson was making the fatal, catastrophic mistake we desperately needed. He was calling Valerie directly in the middle of the night. Brody tapped a single key on his keyboard, and the live audio feed flooded the quiet hotel room. The connection hissed with faint static before the ringing tone began. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, completely paralyzed by the anticipation. The line clicked open, and I heard the voice of the woman I had married 25 years ago. Valerie sounded groggy and deeply irritated. She was currently sleeping in a luxury hotel suite in Denver, supposedly exhausted from weeping in front of the television cameras all day. She answered the phone with a sharp whisper, demanding to know why Trent was violating their strict communication protocols. She reminded him that the police and the media were watching her every single move and that calling her directly was an unacceptable, massive risk. Trent did not care about her protocols. He was completely consumed by blind, suffocating panic. His voice exploded through the computer speakers in a frantic, trembling rush. He completely ignored her warnings and started shouting that the entire operation was a spectacular failure. He told her that he had just received a phone call from the dead. He explained with a terrifying, hysterical edge that someone had just played him a crystal-clear audio recording of their hired arsonist confessing to the entire plot. He screamed that the house was completely empty when the fire started and that James Callahan was entirely alive. He sobbed into the receiver, telling my wife that I possessed all the evidence and that I was actively hunting them from the dark. I sat in the dim hotel room and listened to the profound, heavy silence that followed his frantic confession. I expected Valerie to gasp, or perhaps join him in his terrifying panic. I expected the sudden, shocking realization that her husband was still alive to shatter her completely. Instead, what I heard next chilled me to the absolute core of my bones. Valerie did not cry, and she did not panic. When she finally spoke, her voice was completely devoid of any human warmth or fear. It was a cold, vicious, and deeply calculated hiss. She sounded like a cornered, venomous snake. She demanded that Trent shut his mouth and stop acting like a terrified child. She ruthlessly berated him for his weakness, telling him that his fragile ego was going to ruin the massive empire they had built. Listening to her speak to her secret lover with such brutal condescension was a surreal, deeply disturbing experience. The mask of the grieving widow was completely gone. This was the absolute true face of the woman who had shared my life. Valerie immediately began to assess the catastrophic damage and calculate a new defensive strategy in real time. She asked Trent specific clinical questions about the audio recording. She wanted to know exactly what the arsonist had confessed and whether any physical evidence had been mentioned. Trent stammered that the hired killer had stated his full name and admitted to the entire financial arrangement. Valerie cursed loudly, a sharp, violent sound that echoed through our hotel room. She realized instantly that the clean, flawless narrative of my tragic death was completely destroyed. She took absolute control of the failing conspiracy. She ordered Trent in a tone that brokered absolutely no argument to stick aggressively to the kidnapping narrative. She told him that if the police eventually approached him, he was to play the role of the terrified family friend who was being extorted by unknown, violent criminals. She instructed him to claim that the voice on the phone was just a sophisticated artificial intelligence manipulation created by my supposed kidnappers to extract ransom money. It was a brilliant, terrifyingly adaptive lie designed to confuse the authorities and buy them more time. But the lie was entirely useless because we were already recording every single word she was saying. Then she made the ultimate legally binding mistake. Valerie realized that the low-level arsonists were the massive weak link in their armor. She ordered Trent to immediately contact the remaining hitmen and authorize a final massive wire transfer. She explicitly told him to send them $250,000 from their secure offshore holding company. She demanded he pay them whatever it took to completely silence them and get them out of the country before the sun came up. She used the exact names of the shell corporations and specified the precise routing numbers needed to move the stolen money. She literally orchestrated an international flight to avoid prosecution while explicitly discussing the failed murder plot over an open cellular connection. I looked across the glass table at Mike Brody. His rough features were completely illuminated by the glow of the laptop screen. He simply nodded his head slowly, tapping the digital record button to ensure the massive audio file was permanently secured. The file contained my wife directly acknowledging the arson, explicitly discussing the missing bodies, and authorizing $250,000 in hush money to a pair of professional killers. It was the absolute, undisputed holy grail of criminal evidence. No defense attorney in the country could possibly spin or manipulate that audio recording. The call abruptly ended with Valerie commanding Trent to burn his phone and wait for her next instructions. The digital interface on the screen went completely black. The hotel room was plunged back into heavy, absolute silence. I sat back in my chair feeling a profound, overwhelming sense of finality wash over my tired body. The chaotic, terrifying scramble for survival was officially over. We had successfully survived the blazing inferno, we had secured the massive stolen digital blueprint, and we had secretly purchased the absolute totality of their financial empire. Now we possessed the final, undeniable physical proof of their murderous conspiracy. The massive, invisible trap we had spent the last week meticulously building was now completely inescapable. Valerie and Trent had absolutely nowhere left to run and no money left to hide behind. It was finally time to step out of the dark shadows and show the world that the ghost of James Callahan was very real and incredibly dangerous. I stood up from the glass table and looked toward the window where the first faint light of dawn was breaking over the city skyline. We were ready for the resurrection. Exactly 30 days had passed since the night my sprawling stone estate was violently reduced to a smoking pile of black ash. The fierce autumn winds had finally stripped the last dead leaves from the trees, leaving the city cold and bare. I stood quietly in the shadowed alcove of the grand marble hallway located on the 3rd floor of the county family courthouse. The heavy polished oak doors of courtroom number 4 were securely closed, but I knew exactly what was happening on the other side. Valerie was currently delivering the absolute final act of her masterfully orchestrated tragedy. She was standing before a highly respected family court judge, officially petitioning the state to formally declare me and our 20-year-old son legally dead. She could not afford to wait the standard 7 years required for missing persons. Her entire corrupt empire with Trent Lawson depended heavily on the immediate release of the massive $15 million life insurance policy and the complete transfer of my remaining visible estate. She had hired the most expensive probate attorney in the state to aggressively argue the extreme peril clause utilizing the horrific, fabricated kidnapping narrative she had successfully sold to the local media. I peered carefully through the small rectangular glass window set into the heavy oak door. The courtroom was hushed and deeply solemn. Valerie was seated at the plaintiff table wearing a perfectly tailored black mourning dress that extended gracefully past her knees. She had pinned a small dark veil to her hair, casting a tragic, delicate shadow over her pale face. She held a pristine white tissue tightly in her trembling hands, lightly dabbing at the corners of her eyes whenever the judge looked directly in her direction. It was a breathtaking performance of pure, calculated grief. Sitting directly behind her in the front row of the gallery was Trent Lawson. He wore a dark, conservative suit and maintained a rigid posture, playing the vital role of the fiercely loyal family friend who was bravely supporting the devastated widow through her darkest hour. He occasionally leaned forward to place a comforting hand gently on her shoulder. They looked like a pair of innocent victims completely broken by a random, senseless tragedy. They had absolutely no idea that their massive, invisible financial empire had already been completely dismantled and purchased by the ghost waiting out in the hallway. The high-priced probate attorney paced slowly back and forth across the front of the courtroom. He spoke in low, dramatic tones, outlining the horrific details of our supposed abduction. He presented the judge with the official police reports detailing the complete lack of physical remains found in the burned rubble. He argued passionately that the violent nature of the fire, combined with the terrifying anonymous threats Valerie claimed to have received, provided overwhelming, indisputable evidence that James and Leo Callahan had been brutally murdered by unknown assailants. He explained that the grieving widow was currently facing severe financial ruin because the family trust and the commercial contracting business accounts were completely frozen by the ongoing investigation. It was a brilliant, twisted manipulation of the legal system. He was practically begging the judge to release the millions of dollars so Valerie could supposedly hire private investigators to find our bodies and finally lay her loving family to rest. The judge sat high behind his elevated mahogany bench, looking down at Valerie with profound, genuine sympathy. He slowly reviewed the thick stack of legal documents her attorney had just submitted. The courtroom was incredibly quiet, perfectly reflecting the heavy, solemn nature of the proceedings. The judge adjusted his reading glasses and leaned toward his microphone, preparing to deliver his final ruling. He was just moments away from striking his heavy wooden gavel and officially signing the legal death certificates that would permanently erase our existence and finalize the massive corporate theft. Valerie lowered her head and let a single perfect tear roll down her cheek, completely confident that she had successfully won the deadly game she started 30 days ago. She believed she had outsmarted the law, the media, and the man she had married. She was mere seconds away from walking out of that courthouse as an incredibly wealthy, untouchable woman. I stepped back from the small glass window and looked down at Leo, who was standing silently by my side. I gave my son a slow, firm nod. The meticulous, silent preparation was finally over. The invisible trap was perfectly set, and the bait was completely swallowed. It was time to push the heavy oak doors open. The judge raised his heavy wooden gavel high into the air, preparing to strike the sounding block and legally erase my entire existence from the world. I placed my hands flat against the cold brass push plates of the massive oak doors and shoved them forward with every ounce of strength I had left in my body. The heavy metal hinges groaned loudly, echoing like a gunshot through the absolute pin-drop silence of the solemn courtroom. The gavel froze mid-air in the hand of the bewildered judge. Every single head in the gallery simultaneously snapped toward the back of the room. I stepped across the threshold and walked directly into the bright fluorescent light of the center aisle. I was not a pile of ash, and I was not a terrified kidnapping victim. I was a man returning from the grave dressed in a sharp tailored suit, ready to reclaim everything that had been stolen from me. Leo walked closely by my right side, holding his head high, with a profound, quiet dignity that completely defied his young age. We did not walk alone into that hostile environment. Sylvia Croft marched precisely to my left, clutching her thick leather briefcase tight against her chest like a loaded weapon. Mike Brody flanked my right side, casting a massive, intimidating shadow over the wooden pews. Directly behind us walked 3 armed federal agents wearing dark tactical windbreakers with gold shields gleaming brightly on their chests. The sheer visual shock of our grand entrance completely paralyzed the entire courtroom. A collective gasp rose from the gallery of reporters and spectators filling the high-ceilinged room with a sudden, chaotic murmur. The high-priced probate attorney, who had just passionately narrated my brutal murder, took a stumbling step backward, completely abandoning his wooden podium. His jaw literally dropped open as he stared at the living, breathing contradiction to his entire expensive legal argument. He looked frantically at his thick stack of legal documents and then back at me, completely unable to process the impossible reality walking down his center aisle. The federal agents fanned out smoothly, securing the main exits of the courtroom with quiet, professional efficiency. I did not look at the confused judge or the panicking attorney or the whispering reporters rapidly taking photographs with their cellular phones. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the woman sitting at the plaintiff table, dressed in her perfect, immaculate mourning black. I watched the exact terrifying moment Valerie realized her flawless, indestructible empire was instantly reduced to absolute dust. The transition was physically violent to witness. The delicate, tragic shadow she had carefully cast over her face completely vanished in a millisecond. All the warm color rapidly drained from her skin, leaving her looking completely hollow and sickly pale. The pristine white tissue she had used to expertly dab her fake tears slipped from her trembling fingers and fluttered silently to the polished hardwood floor. She tried to stand up from her heavy wooden chair, but her knees completely buckled under the crushing weight of her immediate profound terror. She collapsed heavily back onto the wooden seat, gripping the edge of the defendant table with such ferocious desperation that her knuckles turned completely white. Her mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish suffocating on dry land, completely unable to formulate a single word or a coherent lie. The masterful, sociopathic actress who had successfully manipulated the media. The police and the justice system was completely stripped of her power in a matter of seconds. Trent Lawson had been sitting directly behind her, playing the role of the stoic, supportive friend. When he turned his head and saw me walking down the aisle, the remaining shreds of his massive, fragile ego completely shattered. He recognized the cold, steady gaze of the man who had played him the audio confession at 3 a.m. His perfectly styled hair and expensive dark suit suddenly looked incredibly pathetic. He instinctively shoved his chair backward, creating a harsh, scraping noise against the floor, attempting to stand up and walk toward the side exit. A tall federal agent immediately stepped directly into his path, placing a heavy, firm hand squarely on his chest. The agent silently forced the panicking developer to sit back down in his wooden pew. Trent looked at Valerie with wild, terrified eyes, but she could not even look at him. She was entirely consumed by the massive, inescapable reality that the husband she tried to burn alive was currently standing right behind her. We reached the front of the courtroom and stopped directly behind the low wooden barrier that separated the gallery from the legal proceedings. The chaotic whispering among the spectators completely died down, replaced by a thick, heavy silence that felt like a physical weight pressing down on the room. The judge slowly lowered his wooden gavel to his desk without making a single sound. He stared down at me over the rims of his reading glasses, his expression shifting rapidly from profound sympathy for a grieving widow to absolute stern confusion. The flawless narrative of the tragic Callahan family fire was officially dead. Sylvia Croft did not give the stunned judge or the panicking defense attorney a single second to recover their composure. She walked with absolute authority straight down the center aisle, completely bypassing the wooden barrier, and approached the elevated mahogany bench. She moved like a seasoned executioner stepping onto the scaffold. The judge finally found his voice, his tone sharp and demanding, as he ordered her to state her name and explain this unprecedented interruption. Sylvia did not flinch. She placed her heavy leather briefcase onto the polished wood of his desk and introduced herself loudly and clearly for the official court record. She stated that she was the retained legal counsel for James and Leo Callahan, and she formally requested the immediate dismissal of the death in absentia petition. She declared in a voice that echoed off the high marble walls that the entire proceeding was a massive fraudulent conspiracy designed to facilitate a corporate theft and cover up an attempted double homicide. A fresh wave of shocked murmurs erupted from the gallery behind me, but Sylvia ignored the noise completely. She unlatched her briefcase with a loud, solid click. She reached inside and pulled out the small silver flash drive my son had brilliantly extracted from his mother's computer. She placed the metallic device gently onto the center of the judge's desk, as if she were laying down a loaded weapon. She explained with cold, clinical precision exactly what the drive contained. She told the judge that it held the complete decrypted contents of Valerie Callahan's private computer. She detailed the hidden offshore banking applications, the heavily encrypted communication logs with Trent Lawson, and the meticulously drafted press releases prepared weeks before the fire ever occurred. She painted a vivid, undeniable picture of a woman who had spent months plotting the brutal assassination of her own family just to finance a secret corporate merger with her lover. The high-priced probate attorney attempted to raise a frantic objection, claiming the evidence was completely unverified and entirely inadmissible in a civil family court. The judge slammed his wooden gavel down with terrifying force, demanding absolute silence from the plaintiff table. He turned his stern, piercing gaze back to Sylvia and ordered her to continue. Sylvia reached back into her leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of freshly printed financial documents. These were not obscure circumstantial records. These were the exact intercepted wire transfer receipts Mike Brody had secured during our invisible digital war. She handed the heavy stack of papers directly to the judge, pointing explicitly to the highlighted routing numbers and the time-stamped authorization codes. She explained that just 48 hours ago, while Valerie was publicly weeping on local television, begging for the safe return of her supposedly kidnapped family, she was secretly authorizing a massive international wire transfer. Sylvia detailed how $250,000 had been successfully moved from a hidden Cayman Islands holding company directly into an untraceable account belonging to a known professional arsonist. She stated clearly that this money was not a ransom payment. It was explicitly authorized hush money paid to the very men who poured toxic chemical accelerant onto my living room floor. The judge traced his finger over the financial ledgers, his face growing increasingly dark with profound righteous fury as he read the undeniable proof of the massive financial crime. But Sylvia was not finished dismantling the carefully constructed lies. She reached into her briefcase one final time and produced a bound folder containing the official certified transcripts of the digital audio recordings. She handed the folder to the judge and explained the terrifying context of the conversations. She described the violent late-night confrontation in the subterranean parking garage, where the hired arsonist confessed to the entire failed assassination attempt. She then turned her head slightly and looked directly at Trent Lawson, who was sweating profusely in the front row of the gallery. She told the judge about the frantic, panicked phone call Trent had made to Valerie in the middle of the night. She pointed to the specific pages in the transcript where Valerie explicitly ordered Trent to stick to the fake kidnapping narrative and demanded he silence the hitmen before the police found them. Sylvia offered to play the raw audio files right there in the courtroom for everyone to hear Valerie's cold, vicious voice echoing over the speakers. The judge held up his hand, stopping her. He did not need to hear the audio tape to understand the sheer magnitude of the evil standing in his courtroom. He spent 3 long, agonizing minutes reading through the typed transcripts. The absolute heavy silence in the room was suffocating. Every single lie Valerie had spent the last 30 days meticulously building was being violently ripped apart page by page. Her pristine image as a tragic, devastated widow was completely annihilated. She was no longer a victim seeking closure. She was a documented monster trapped in a cage of her own making. The judge slowly lowered the bound folder onto his desk and took off his reading glasses. He looked over the mahogany bench directly at Valerie. The profound sympathy that had warmed his eyes just 10 minutes ago was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, hard look of absolute judicial disgust. He did not ask her to explain herself. He did not offer her a chance to speak or defend her actions. The evidence Sylvia Croft had systematically laid out was completely insurmountable. The legal execution was entirely flawless. Valerie sat frozen at the plaintiff table, her chest heaving, as she finally realized that there was absolutely no escape from the devastating truth we had just unleashed upon her. The judge did not hesitate for another second. He looked directly at the federal agents standing by the wooden doors and gave them a sharp nod. The lead agent stepped forward, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. He walked straight toward the plaintiff table, where my wife was still frozen in absolute terror. He grabbed Valerie by her upper arm and roughly pulled her to her feet. She did not fight him. She simply let out a pathetic whimpering sound as he twisted her arms behind her back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs locking around her wrists echoed loudly through the silent courtroom. It was the absolute final sound of her reign. She looked over her shoulder at me, her eyes pleading for a mercy she absolutely did not deserve. I did not blink and I did not look away. I simply watched the federal agent recite her Miranda rights loud enough for every single reporter in the gallery to record. Trent Lawson realized the trap was fully closed, and his fragile ego completely shattered into pure panic. He stood up from the wooden pew and desperately tried to distance himself from the woman he had conspired with. He started shouting frantically to the entire room, claiming he had absolutely no idea what Valerie was planning, and that he was completely innocent. He pointed a trembling finger at her, calling her a deranged monster who manipulated him. Sylvia Croft turned around and looked at him with a cold, predatory smile. She walked over to the low wooden barrier, holding a single manila folder in her hand. She did not raise her voice, but she spoke with absolute, devastating authority. She told Trent to save his pathetic lies for the federal prosecutor. Then she handed him the folder containing the formal legal notices of his absolute financial ruin. She watched his eyes scan the pages as she delivered the final fatal blow. She informed him in front of the entire captivated gallery that the anonymous hedge fund holding every single one of his toxic development loans was completely owned and operated by me. She told him that the massive influx of stolen capital he had just poured into his properties now belonged entirely to my holding companies. The heavy realization hit him like a physical brick to the chest. He looked up from the papers, staring at me with complete, horrifying understanding. He finally realized that while he was busy paying professional killers to burn my house down, I had systematically purchased his entire life. I legally owned his luxury towers, his suburban developments, and every single dollar he thought he possessed. His knees buckled and he collapsed back onto the wooden bench, dropping the manila folder onto the floor. 2 more federal agents immediately flanked him, pulling him to his feet and locking a second pair of steel handcuffs around his wrists. The courtroom erupted into absolute frenzy as the reporters rushed forward, shouting questions and snapping rapid photographs. The agents ignored the frenzy. They forcefully marched my wife and her secret partner down the center aisle, completely stripping them of their false dignity. Valerie kept her head bowed, hiding her face from the flashing cameras, while Trent stumbled forward completely broken and weeping openly. I watched them disappear through the heavy oak doors, entirely ruined by their own arrogant greed. They were walking out of my life forever, heading straight into a cold, dark concrete cell, while I remained standing in the bright light of the courtroom, perfectly vindicated and completely whole. I turned my back on the chaotic scene unfolding inside courtroom number 4. I did not need to watch the federal agents drag my wife away to know that my long, silent war was finally over. I felt a deep, profound sense of peace settle over my tired bones. I reached out and placed my right hand firmly on the shoulder of my son. Leo looked up at me, and for the first time in 30 days, I saw a genuine, relaxed smile completely transform his young face. The heavy, terrifying burden of pure survival had finally been lifted from his shoulders. We turned away from the shouting reporters and the blinding camera flashes. We walked slowly together down the long marble corridor, leaving the shattered remnants of our old life completely behind us. We pushed through the heavy glass exit doors and stepped out onto the wide stone steps of the county courthouse. The crisp, cold autumn air filled my lungs like a physical blessing. The bright, brilliant midday sun washed over us, illuminating the busy city streets below. We had walked into that building as forgotten ghosts, and we were walking out as absolute survivors. The violent, literal fire my wife ignited had successfully burned our beautiful estate to the ground and destroyed my entire physical past. But as I stood there, breathing in the fresh air, I realized that the inferno had also burned away every single toxic lie I had been living for the last 2 decades. It had purified my existence completely. I had spent 40 years believing that a marriage certificate and shared blood were the absolute unbreakable foundations of a family. I was spectacularly, tragically wrong. True family is never defined by a legal contract or a shared suburban residence. True family is forged in the absolute darkest, most terrifying moments of your life, when everything you love is violently burning to the ground, and you discover exactly who is willing to stand beside you in the blistering heat. My quiet, brilliant son had proven his unwavering loyalty and his massive intellect in a way that I will honor for the rest of my days. I looked out over the sprawling city, knowing that the massive commercial empire I had reclaimed from Trent Lawson was now perfectly secure and entirely under my command. I was no longer building a legacy for a greedy, ungrateful spouse who viewed me as nothing more than an expiring bank account. I was going to build an entirely new foundation based on absolute, unvarnished truth, fierce, unquestionable loyalty, and deep mutual respect. I was going to teach my incredibly capable son exactly how to run the massive empire he had just helped me save. We walked down the wide stone steps together, leaving the shadows completely behind us. The dark, terrifying night was finally over, and our new life had officially begun. The greatest lesson I learned from the ashes of my old life is that true danger rarely announces itself with a loud warning. It often hides behind a perfect smile and a familiar face. We spend our lives building physical fortresses to protect our wealth completely, forgetting that the most devastating threats can sleep right beside us in the dark. Never underestimate the quiet intuition of a child, and never assume that shared history guarantees absolute loyalty. True family is not defined by legal documents, but strictly by the brave people who stand with you when the fire starts. If you found strength in this story of survival and justice, please hit the subscribe button for more powerful life lessons.